Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
When the doctor told me I only had about a year left to live, I took the news surprisingly well. Perhaps because my life's been so fucking empty for the last 10 years that I didn't really feel like I was losing out all that much on life by ending it shortly. Ovarian cancer, caused by some strange, hard-to-diagnose syndrome inherited from my mother. She had died of something similar, according to my Aunt Elizabeth. My aunt had always been there for me, up until the shithead years where I ran away with a guy as a teenager, only to learn after a miscarriage that life with a barren wife is not very appealing. After that, my aunt was really all I had in life, and I was grateful when she offered me a place to stay while I got things in order. So, like I said, I wasn't that surprised or upset about it all. Not really, once I got past the initial reaction. I was determined to make the best of my last year, though. My aunt was retired now, and I did my best to help around the house and garden. At the time, I made my living producing scarves and other pretty meaningless things to sell to bored housewives who spent too much free time on Pinterest. Most of my hair had fallen out, so I had taken to wearing a perfumed scarf around my head. One I had made for myself, with silver spiderweb patterns. My family all seemed to have a knack for sewing. For a rare moment, I felt content as I sat on the tree swing, gazing up at the house. Coming back here was soothing to me, the pain somehow less harsh as I surrounded myself with familiar settings. I was tired all the time, and the chemo made me sick as a dog, but as soon as I got in the door, I began to feel better. The house was built in 2 sections, meeting at a right angle, with verandas and widow's walks and all the trimmings of a Victorian manor house. The most unique thing about it was a spired turret that jutted up from the roof where the 2 halves of the house met, easily a full floor higher than the rest of the house. Rose trellises, overgrown with ivy, dotted the angled walls of the turret, ending just before the nearest windows on the 3rd floor. As far back as I could remember, that turret had been off limits. I'd always been curious about it, and as soon as I was old enough to notice it, I asked my aunt why I wasn't allowed to go up there. She would smile and assure me that when the time was right, I'd be let up there. Unsatisfied with that answer, I was determined to find a way. I searched everywhere, in the dozens of rooms. I tried the dumbwaiters. I even tried one time to see if I could reach the bottom of the trellises with a ladder, and was grounded for a week when the ladder fell and smashed into the garden greenhouse. Nothing I tried worked. Soon I accepted that there was probably nothing up there but junk, like every attic. As I gazed up at the turret, I thought I saw a face in the dark window. It was such a strange sight that it took me a moment to even realize what I'd seen. I told myself it had to have been a trick of the light. There was no way someone could be up there. The turret stairs, or whatever, had to have been walled off long before I'd ever lived there. I was starting to feel fatigued in the growing heat, and dismissed the whole notion in favor of a nap. The chemo was getting to me, and even though I dreaded waking up to find more hair on my pillows, I relished sleep. Dreamless, emotionless, a reprieve from my growing depression and pain. Sometimes, when I slept particularly deep, I could almost hear a distant voice singing, bringing me back to my childhood in the garden, with memories of a girl I used to play with. I had a happy childhood. Growing up in the large 3-story historical home, I had no lack of love from my aunt. Despite keeping a lucrative nursery and an immaculate private garden, she never failed to make time for her niece. When, on rare occasions, I did feel lonesome for company, I'd used to go into the garden and play with my imaginary friend. Well, I say friend, but she was really more like an imaginary twin sister. We both had the same blue eyes, same pointed nose, same smile, same everything, almost. The only difference between us was that my hair was dark and short, and hers long, flowing, and completely devoid of color. I called her Silvia. We had the best of times pushing each other on a tree swing or braiding flowers to each other's hair. When I was done playing with her for the day, I'd come in from the garden and breathlessly tell my Aunt Elizabeth about all the adventures I had with Silvia. Aunt Elizabeth would smile over her cup of rose tea and slowly shake her head when I asked why I could never play with Silvia outside of the garden. Silvia is a special girl. She's your responsibility as your special sister. She can't leave the house, but I promise you, she will always be with you. And I smiled at that, knowing in my young heart that Aunt was right. Silvia was special, and I wanted to play with her forever. I grew up, of course, and Silvia stopped showing up in the garden. I made new friends, and soon I almost, but not quite, forgot about my strange twin with silver hair. My aunt was just playing along, knowing how important it was for a shy child like me to have a friend. I woke up an hour later to the sound of knocking on the front door. Pushing aside another depressing clot of hair on my pillow, I frowned when I noticed that some of it was silver. I knew that I was holding in a lot of stress that I should have been dealing with better, but nobody in my family grazed this fast. I checked myself in the mirror, but couldn't find any other silver against what was left of my own natural raven. I shrugged it off and went down to answer the door. It was Tim, a young college-aged guy who helped my aunt on the weekend with her garden, doing the harder work that neither my aunt or I had the physical strength to handle. I guess he was handsome in that football jock kind of way. Blonde hair, blue eyes, rugged jawline. I didn't know him all that well, and I suppose that seeing someone on death's doorstep made him uncomfortable, because we never spoke all that much whenever we were around each other. I felt ugly with my thinning hair and sallow skin. I did my best to avoid him within the realms of politeness. After a few hours, I decided that I'd offer him some lunch, and carried some sandwiches and a jug of iced tea out into the yard. Tim was standing in the middle of the garden, staring blankly up at something in the sky. He looked like a dog, listening with one ear cocked, hearing something that nobody else could. I had to nudge his shoulder to get his attention. It was weird, like he'd been asleep while standing up. His eyes were dreamy when he looked down at me, and I could have sworn his pupils were bigger than normal. Tim then shook his head and accepted the tray with a grateful smile. We ate in awkward silence, both sitting on a garden bench. "Do you guys have a guest visiting?" he asked out of the blue midway through the meal. The question caught me off guard. "No, nobody's here but us. My aunt is at the store." "Why?" I asked, putting my sandwich down on my lap. "Oh, I guess I was just imagining things. Never mind. Look, I gotta go pick up more mulch from the hardware store and stuff. Can you tell your aunt I'll be back tomorrow?" he asked. There was disappointment in his voice, a mix of confusion and anxiety that wasn't normal for him. He left me alone among the flowers, only stopping to stare up at the sky again, before hurrying out of the yard. I followed his gaze this time, up to the turret. The windows were empty. My aunt got home later that evening, and she seemed more tired than usual. I guess she was getting on in years. All that hard work tending to her beloved flowers was finally catching up with her. We chatted about idle nothings over roasted ham, and again I felt compelled to ask about the turret. She seemed uncomfortable about the subject, especially when I told her about what Tim and I thought we'd seen. "Oh, that's been falling apart for years. The floors are rotted to nearly nothing. It's safer to just leave it alone." "Why not get Tim or someone to fix it?" "Well, I just never got around to it, I guess." She left it at that, excusing herself to turn in early. The next morning was a little better, feeling well rested for a change. I took the car into town and decided to shop for something nice to cook for dinner as a thank you to my aunt. While waiting in line with my cart of groceries, I couldn't help but overhear two women ahead of me talking. I'm not usually much for eavesdropping, but I wanted something to distract myself from the odd mood since yesterday. Third guy this year. It's really starting to worry us. I heard Becky is holding a vigil. Maybe we should go and give her our support. It'd be good for her to get closure after that long... You kind of just have to assume, well, you know. The cashier finished checking them out, and it was my turn. Despite my better judgment, I asked the girl behind the counter what the two ladies had been talking about. Since I don't get out that much, I really didn't know much of anything that had happened in Red Oak since I left. Oh, that? It's tragic, really. About a year ago, Brian Crispin went missing. He went to a party on campus and nobody's seen him since. Two other guys vanished too. The police haven't got any leads. It's like they just up and disappeared. She nodded over towards a bulletin board near the store vestibule. Color photos xeroxed onto bright blue paper. 3 young men, all in the prime of life. I felt a cold sense of déjà vu. They all had blonde hair and blue eyes. Just like Tim. I felt a wave of queasiness wash over me and quickly paid for my food without comment. I was sore by the time I pulled into the driveway and decided that I'd take a shower to soothe my muscles after putting away the groceries. A good hot shower and time to mull over all the strangeness. It felt good, the hot water cascading down my aching muscles and the white noise clearing my head of the creepy concerns. As I pulled my hand away from my lathered-up scalp, more silver hair glittered on my hands. This time, though, the ends weren't from me, but from above. Clinging to the ceiling like cobwebs, I instantly shook my head, realizing it wasn't hair, but webbing. Disgusting! The house had its fair share of dust, but this was beyond normal. Hastily, I rinsed my hair and fled the shower and dressed to get dinner on the table. Do you remember the imaginary girl I used to play with as a kid? I asked my aunt over plates of baked ziti. This time, for sure, she wasn't meeting my eyes. She had grown distant over the last few weeks, distracted and almost evasive during our conversations. I don't recall. Why do you ask? Just thinking. Spending a lot of time in the garden brought up memories about playing with her in the garden. The silence between us was abnormal. My aunt was a talkative, almost overbearing woman usually, and seeing her behave this way was making me uneasy. Well, perhaps I do remember a little. Children need friends, especially the lonely ones, she answered, leaving the subject closed for discussion, as she excused herself to take care of something in her room. Neither of us finished our meal that night, and I decided to occupy my troubled mind with my latest sewing project. The rat-a-tat of the machine always calmed me. Perhaps my life was barren, but it was comforting to know I could at least contribute small tokens of beauty to the world, however frivolous. A sudden and loud shuffling noise from above made me jump. Whatever it was loud, like something heavy being moved across the floor. I turned off the machine and gazed up at the ceiling, puzzled. That was my aunt's room. What on earth could she be moving at this late hour? Too rattled and pensive to concentrate on my work anymore, I decided to head upstairs to bed. As I made my way through the upstairs hallway, I stopped to look out the window overlooking the garden. It was another one of those rare moments of sublime tranquility. Only I wasn't the only one enjoying the late-night air, it seemed. Something dark and bulky scampered across the yard. I almost considered just chalking it up to my imagination, but it darted forward again, right to the middle of the backyard, before standing still. I watched for several minutes, gripping the windowsill despite the thick cobwebs gathered on it, trying to make out who or what that shape was, and whether I should call 911. Just as quickly as it came, it ran off again. Too tired to put up with pointless police platitudes, I dismissed it as some kid taking a shortcut home. It wasn't an unusual sight in a backwater town like this. I just wished I knew what had made the stranger stand so still like that. The following morning, I went downstairs to the kitchen to get a start on breakfast. The sun was rising past the tree line surrounding the garden, and through the window over the kitchen sink, I was shocked to see Tim was out in the yard. He wasn't supposed to be here. Not at 7 in the morning. He was standing in the exact same spot the stranger was as yesterday, staring up blankly at the turret. This was too much. Whatever the hell was going on, I wanted answers. Pulling my robe closer, I moved to the back porch and called out to Tim loudly. He didn't seem to hear me, even though I had shouted at the top of my lungs. I called again, and he still ignored me. What the hell? Was he high or something? I marched over and gripped his shoulder, forcing him to turn and look at me, and then stepped back in disgust. His eyes were dilated, and there was drool oozing down his chin. He gripped at his crotch with one hand, obviously aroused. He was looking right through me, head cocked to one side, as if listening for something in the air. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking through me. I backed away quickly, afraid that Tim might attack me in his deranged state. Whatever the hell he was on, it had clearly driven him insane. I remembered stories about guys on PCP going berserk and tearing people apart with their bare hands, only brought down by multiple bullet wounds in their frenzy. But Tim didn't move towards me. Tim didn't even acknowledge my presence. He turned away and stared up at the turret, still rubbing at himself. Only when I followed his gaze did I see the flash of white at the window. It shimmered in the late afternoon sun and trickled down the ivy like water. That voice! I want to see her! I need to see her! He giggled like a schoolboy mooning over a first crush. Still backing away until my legs nudged against the tree swing, I could only stare in horror as Tim ran at the house. At first I thought he intended to smash through the plate glass patio door, but he swerved to the left, directly underneath the turret, and whatever was slowly cascading down from the high window. It sparkled and shimmered, spreading out in some places, joining together again, in long ropes of silvery white strands. Closer up now, it looked like hair. Long curtains and coils of it, snaking down the wall like it was alive. By now, Tim was jumping and reaching for it with one hand, grunting lustily while trying to undo his belt buckle with his other with addled fingers. The hair joined together in front of his face, arching itself to meet at eye level, looking more than ever like a great coiled cord of silky strands. Then it struck, wrapping itself around Tim's neck with a cobra's speed. His hands no longer sought pleasure, but instead pulled on the insistent hairs. His eyes bulged and his tongue poked out, horribly. Without any effort, the hair lifted Tim completely off the ground, still wrapping around his body as his feet kicked at the walls to either side, hands still clawing as the hair carried him up, and then through the high turret window. I dropped to my knees in shock, and then vomited. As if on cue, my aunt moved out from behind the greenhouse and stood over me. Her face was sad, but there wasn't any concern or fear on it. She patiently held my shoulder as I vomited again until there was nothing left to come up. There, dear. I knew I shouldn't have left you alone. You weren't supposed to see that yet, she whispered, more to herself than me. Arms still wrapped around my shaking shoulders, Aunt Elizabeth ushered me into the kitchen and made us both a strong pot of tea. Shouldn't we call the police? I asked when I was finally able to stop crying. Tim had been attacked, was probably dead. How could we sit here drinking tea while whatever monster living in our attic was probably eating Tim alive? There's no need, said Aunt Elizabeth, and poured tea into the cup in front of me, as well as a shot of something from a dark glass bottle. Drink that, dear. It'll make you feel better. I did. And it did. I always liked it when Aunt Elizabeth put brandy in the tea. Now, she said, composing herself seriously, I'm going to need you to stay calm. There are things about our family that you need to know. If you think you've calmed down enough, I'll show you what's been up in our attic all these years. But you have to promise me that you won't scream. Screaming upsets her."
Her? Her who? I almost lost it again there. Who the hell was my aunt talking about?
It's better to just show you. Then you'll believe what I need to tell you.
Aunt Elizabeth led the way upstairs to her bedroom. It was small and full of flowers from the garden. On the far wall was a large bookshelf, which I remembered had always seemed to be too big for such a small room. Its presence made sense now, as my aunt undid a hidden latch at the side, and the whole thing swung forward to reveal a hidden staircase. Putting a finger to her lips, Aunt Elizabeth climbed the stairs, which went up in a long spiral, until finally ending at a locked door. I knew with dead certainty that this was the turret, and the home of whatever monster had eaten Tim, and likely eaten those other boys from town. The door didn't open onto an attic space full of junk, like I expected. The wide, circular room was carpeted and furnished. There were spiderwebs everywhere, hanging from the rafters, covering the bed and chairs, clinging to the walls. Everything was either blue, white, or silver. Everything, except for a clump of something red and wet near the open window at the far wall. I recoiled as I noticed that the spiderwebs were moving. It was hair. The same silver hair I had been seeing for the last several days. It was the same hair I had seen attack Tim, meaning that the lump in the middle of the room was Tim. I gasped as the lump lurched around suddenly, only to be wound more tightly by the thousands of silvery hairs. Tim was like a bug in its cocoon, struggling to escape from the kiss of a spider. A shadow loomed over Tim's thrashing body, and as my eyes went up to the source of the shadow, my heart nearly stopped. Hanging from the ceiling by spidery limbs was an awful sight. From the waist up, the thing looked like a beautiful young woman of about my age. Naked, although the countless silver hairs framing her face seemed to instinctively cover her like a loose robe. Her lower half was monstrous, ending at the hips in a wide blob of hard, black, spiked carapace. 8 long, clawed legs issued from the lower torso, supporting her against the ceiling. More grotesque still, that carapace gave way to a great, sucking maw just under her navel, and razor-sharp fangs on either side of it, clicking with hungry anticipation as they drooled venomous fluid. I watched in sick fascination as the creature slowly lowered itself over Tim's still cocooned body. The human-like part of her picked up the squirming mass and embraced it, lovingly. Tim stilled for a moment, and then tensed up as the massive mawed underside reared up and sank its fangs into his stomach. She continued to nuzzle his body as it struggled, like a patient lover. I couldn't watch any more, turning and burying my face into my aunt's shoulder.
"Her name is Silvia, and she's your sister. She needs your help,"
my aunt whispered, stroking my back as she looked over my shoulder at the terrible monster hanging from the ceiling. I pulled back, shaking my head, but my aunt cut me off before I could say anything.
"We're not human, dear. We're special. There's always twins. Your mother was my twin. You see, only one of us can live among humans, and the other ends up like your sister Silvia. Your mother died just after you were born. It was my job to raise you two, like my own. Just like Silvia will need you to raise her girls after she is gone. Our sisters are born to breed and die, while you and I are born to live and see the next generation through. The name explained it all. I hadn't imagined Silvia. She had really been here, this whole time. But that was wrong. How could this monster be the little girl I had loved so much all those years ago? It was unthinkable. Yet, as I turned to look at the monster now, I could see that we had the same blue eyes. Her smile was warm, and it was my smile. If not for the silver hair, we would be identical. Your sister has been feeding for a year now, because it's time for her to have her babies. We live for a long time, healthy and strong enough to protect our sisters. But once the younger twin becomes of age, they go into a state of metamorphosis and take the shape she has now. My aunt moved past me and reached up to brush Sylvia's cheek fondly. The monster mewed like a kitten, nuzzling my aunt's hand while still hugging Tim's shrouded corpse to her breasts. She hunts by singing and lures men to her room. She's not evil. There is just no other way for her to live. She'd never survive without me to look after her. And neither will her daughters, if you don't take up the responsibility. Does that make us monsters too? For letting this go on? Perhaps. But that's for you to decide. Aunt Elizabeth reached out for my hand. And despite my horror, I couldn't help but feel compelled to approach the monster that I was to call my sister. She purred as she lowered herself down to me, two of her great spider legs reaching down to pick up Tim's body and stick it up into the rafters. Her now free arms tentatively reached out as she gazed down at me. Little strands of silver hair tickled at my arms and legs, soft as silk. She's missed you, I think. It's very lonely here. She can't really have company like this, except for me, and, well, now you. Every girl needs a friend, after all. I looked back at my aunt and nodded. It was an unfair existence. It wasn't Sylvia's fault she was born like this. No more fair than my being eaten alive by cancer. I felt bad for Tim and the others, but somehow it wasn't enough to raise the same horror anymore. Instead, I felt my heart skip a beat when suddenly Silvia wrapped her arms around my shoulders and kissed my cheek, just like when we played in the garden as children. It isn't one-sided either, dear. My aunt came up beside me and stroked my hair. The older of us have long lives and good health. Silvia and her younger daughter will make sure of that for you. It's not a bad life, really. My time may come soon, but your life is just beginning now. You have a beautiful life ahead of you. I turned to look up at Silvia, to look up at the face I shared with her, the face of my dear twin sister, and smiled. A year and a half later, my aunt passed away in a tragic car accident. I still live in the same house I grew up in. I still tend the garden. The doctors are all amazed that my cancer has gone into complete remission, with 4 years past the point where I should have died. I'm healthier than I've been in years, and happier now that I have 2 beautiful little girls in my life. They're very close as they can be. The adoption papers were already made up, and my new friends always ask, how can they look so much like me even though we're not related? I simply pass it off as good fortune, a blessing from above. What could bring you more joy than 2 beautiful little girls, one with dark hair, and one with hair as silver as spider's silk?
I can see my house from here atop this small cliff at the edge of the woods. I suppose he could see his too once. But it's my time now. My time to look upon things taken from me. My turn to take root in what has become my new home. My father and I came here from Sussex in the spring of 1742. We were poor, barely getting by and not far from a life of poverty in the streets. Truth be told, we fared no better than that. Father was out of work, and we lived in a small hut that barely kept out the wind and snow. We went days at a time without food, and sickness came easy. Mother, she didn't make it. Father and I barely scraped by that winter, and with nothing to show for it but a long, pitiless bout of mourning. I was only 5 at the time, helpless, and Father swore he would never lose me the way he lost Mother. Needless to say, it was a tough decision, but he supposed we'd find a better life in the colonies, even if the only way to see us across the Atlantic was in a redcoat with a musket in hand. So, after a number of months at sea, we found ourselves in a small fort south of Boston, my father serving His Majesty in the New World. We were sent here directly, with little to no welcome or induction. They said Father would find everything he needed here on arrival, from training and briefing to housing accommodations. They said they needed all the help they could get, no time for formalities. Their sense of urgency made Father nervous, but we never really had a chance to protest or reconsider, especially since we had already come so far. We were escorted to our new home within a week. Fort Wayland, they called it, a fringe installment with no real strategic value. Apparently, the place served another purpose. At first, some spoke of it with sarcasm and dissent, annoyed to have been stationed there for such a ludicrous reason. They regarded it as nothing more than their commanding officer's paranoid response to an old ghost story, though some say they saw it with their own eyes. In any case, that fort was not meant to guard against any man. It was meant to keep something more sinister at bay. We had hardly settled in before we started seeing something too, whatever it was. They sounded like children, about the same size I was, except they made no sound but for the rustling of leaves under their feet, or at least what I assumed were feet. I never really saw them clearly either, just fleeting glances before they scurried back into the brush or the treetops. They weren't human, that much was certain. They terrified every man within those fort walls, armed or otherwise, especially when they learned that weapons fire was useless. Every shot missed its mark. After all, one cannot hit what one can hardly see. When we arrived, hunting parties still regularly ventured deep into the woods in an attempt to rid us of whatever haunted them. Though the terror destroyed morale, and a few men even deserted. Rather, that's what we had hoped. They were never seen or heard from again, and nobody liked to entertain the idea of the alternative. Yet, for all of the constant fear and worry, there was only ever a single obvious victim, only one person for whom we could reasonably assume an unpleasant end. In spite of all of his massed forces and paranoia, it was the captain, they claimed. The men said they found his quarters empty one day, ransacked, and the floor covered with fallen leaves and twigs. Just as the other unfortunates, he had vanished without a trace. Strangely, everything fell quiet after that. No more sounds of children pattering about the woods. No more sightings. No more terror. It seemed that they had claimed what they were after. They had no interest in the rest of us. Before long, the whole ordeal faded to an unpleasant memory, and a sense of normality finally settled in. By then, Father had already watched over those woods for the better part of 12 years. His service earned us enough money for a new life in this land, and we took the opportunity as soon as it presented itself. Father resigned from military service, choosing a civilian life to raise me and open a general store. When the military pulled out and stationed elsewhere, the fort itself served nicely for the foundations of a trading post. And that is where we stayed for the remainder of my childhood. When he finally scraped together enough money, Father left to open a store in South Boston. It was a dream he had spoken of from the moment we arrived on these shores. I had helped run his business over the years, so he invited me to move with him to settle down and start a family business. Still, he left the decision up to me. I was 17, and he considered me a man. Looking back now, I wish I had. Instead, I chose to stay behind, strike my own path through life. I had made friends with some other boys during my time there, hunting rabbits in the woods after the danger had passed. It was something I loved, and several of us decided to make a living hunting and trapping, selling our wares at the trade post in my father's old store. For the following 5 years, life had been good to me. The forest had blessed me with abundant bounty and a respectable living, as well as the attention of a young girl I might have married one day. I had built a happy life for myself, and I thought I had come to know every corner of those woods. But then they returned, and they showed me a place I never knew existed, a place with which I've since become all too familiar. They arrived slowly at first, a few rustling sounds on hunts that I took for foxes or squirrels in the underbrush. Then the sounds grew in number, more frequent, more hectic, and they followed me. They were no animals I knew, these things that so boldly approached without fear of man. On one of my longer outings, they haunted my camp. I began to see them in the shadows, just beyond the firelight, clearer than I ever had before. Mischievous little imps, bodies like knots of wood and vines, tufts of grass and flowering plants, atop bobbling lumps with the vague semblance of heads. They danced like elated children in and out of the light, and they made sounds I'd never heard from them before. Scratchy, wet, clicking noises like ghostly giggles from broken throats. This behavior was new. Where they had once hidden from me, they now clearly sought my attention. In fact, they seemed to beckon. Truly, I sensed no hostility from them, and from the depths of the woods came something else new. A sweet scent hanging on the breeze, warm and welcoming in the same manner as freshly baked bread, perhaps more so. I'd not have thought to call it merely pleasant. No, it was more compelling. That scent, that bewitching aroma came from them. It was a portent of their coming, and it grew stronger with their every visit. It was like nothing I had ever smelled, terribly powerful, and it stirred something in me. I know now that they used it to lure me, and I'm sad to say that it was to great effect. Totally unaware of myself, I began to track my quarry on a very specific path, a narrow and invisible road marked by that damnable odor. When it would fade off, I would sink into melancholy and fatigue, dissatisfied with the typically brisk and invigorating air of the wild. I would make camp when it left me, sometimes early to ease my growing weariness, and there I would remain until the scent returned, and it always did. Those woods nearly chewed me to the bone before I found my way through, and the imps of leaf and root led me faithfully to my fate. I crawled my way through a gauntlet of dense thorn brushes from dawn till dusk, and they left my clothing in tatters that barely clung to my form. I was an utter mess, caked from head to toe in the drying filth of the untamed acres I left behind. I had no provisions left and little energy left for travel. One can imagine my relief when I finally emerged into a clearing, and in that clearing awaited a small, crude, precariously constructed cabin. I was astonished, to say the least. It was deeper in the woods than I had ever bothered to explore, deeper than my trade would ever take me, and much too far for any sign of civilization to be worth the trip. For whatever reason, the latter half of my journey provided little to no game to sustain me, let alone to make a living. Worse yet, I could find no source of clean water within reasonable distance. Who would build a home here? And how could they possibly hope to survive? Of course, I was not in the proper state of mind to give these questions the consideration they warranted. Near death, and with no way to survive the trek home, even if the imps would grant me control of my senses to do so, I could only rejoice at the chance of rescue. So I approached the cabin, hoping beyond hope for a hot meal, a cool drink, and a warm bed for the night. It was only in those first few steps into the clearing that I escaped the bewitching scent trail for the first time in what must have been months. I left home in the middle of summer that year, and I arrived at the cabin to find leaves crunching beneath my boots. And with that sound came another realization. It was the only sound I could hear. In fact, it was the only sound I had heard in quite some time. For days preceding, as far as I could tell, I had been the only source of movement or life in those woods. I hadn't heard so much as a single bird chirping in the canopy. I had been too entranced by the scent to notice, but no life resided there other than the trees, myself, and whoever occupied the mysterious cabin that stood before me. The thought unnerved me, though not enough to sway me from seizing the chance. Slowly, cautiously, I approached the door. Each step through the crunching forest floor betrayed my presence, rendering any attempt at stealth effectively useless. Something about the place seemed so ominous, so damning. Part of me felt the urge to flee, but another part felt welcome. Little did I know just how welcome I really was, but I would soon learn. As my loud approach sounded in the otherwise total silence, nothing answered my intrusion, yet somehow I still knew I was not alone. I couldn't see it, I couldn't hear it, but something or someone was watching. It had been watching my entire journey through this territory, watching with eager intent. It summoned me here, and for a reason. Nobody answered my knocks, so I slowly opened the door about the width of my wrist and peered inside. There, at the far end of the nearly empty room, I found a rather disturbing surprise. An old, thin man curled up on a bed made of leaves and grass, and I recognized his face. Captain Harrison, who no one had seen since we found his office abandoned all those years ago. He had apparently been living here in seclusion. I'm unsure just how long I stood there staring at him. I had not seen the man since I was a small child. I'd given him up for dead like everyone else. Yet, here he was, alive and looking like he had seen the worst of every year since his disappearance. He'd wasted away to nearly nothing, now little more than a rickety skeleton, and thinning skin pocked over with liver spots. He'd bald significantly, and what little hair skirted that shiny hemisphere had grown long and matted with filth. The only familiar part of him was his uniform, although it had changed just as much. It had grown dirtier than I had ever imagined any garment could, and rendered nearly to shreds. "Captain Harrison?" I hesitantly called. He started, as did I. He seemed ill, laying with such stillness that I thought he'd taken to his deathbed. The sudden movement was jarring, but I couldn't blame him. It must have been the first word he'd heard spoken by another in years. "Who's there?" he croaked, thinning his eyes against the fresh light shining through the gloom. At first I was speechless. I could not bring myself to reply. "Who's there? Who calls me by that name?" he hoarsely demanded. I knew you," I stammered. "My father, he served under you, Fort Wayland. Do you remember?" He stood on weak legs and hobbled toward me as quickly as they would carry him. I recoiled a bit when he thrust his face uncomfortably close to my own. He gazed at me with bewilderment as if through a dense fog. "Wayland, you, the young ones," he muttered, and his fall breath stung my eyes. He paused at length, then looked away. "Now, another time, another life. I have no name now. I care for them. They need me." He trailed off, meandering back to his bed of grass. He lay down and faced the wall, dismissing my presence. I raised my voice, shouted, poked, and prodded, but to no avail. It didn't seem that he was ignoring me so much as, in his mind, I simply ceased to exist. I could hear him muttering in his fitful sleep something about elder trees and saplings and how he wished to join them. Clearly he had gone quite mad. Though if he had indeed been tormented by the same entities that led me to him, if he suffered that bewitching odor and the dancing of the imps for all those years, his state of mind made perfect sense. I could not imagine what he must have been through. Begrudgingly, I gave up trying to rouse him. He would answer my questions in the morning. Until then, I was content to rest on the other side of the room. Honestly, I should have never closed my eyes in such a dreadful place, much less while sharing it with a madman. However, I had no strength to brave those woods any farther. I doubt the imps would have let me wander far anyway. I had little choice. My sleep was restless that night, even painful. Torrential dreams of howling voices calling to me. Clouds of dust rose and swirled about me, obscuring my vision. It grew thicker, settling atop my tongue, in my nostrils and ears, and over my eyes. It solidified around me like a crystallizing tomb, and I soon found myself held tightly within the crushing fist of the earth. The weight of ages grew tighter against my body, constricting me until it squeezed the last breath of air from my lungs. I should have died then, but I somehow remained awake and alert enough to sense the minute rumbling of something weaving through the soil. Roots worked their way around my arms and legs, ensnaring them as my eyes darted in panic behind closed lids. There was no escape. They wound about my torso and they pierced my chest with surprising sharpness. Through the burning agony, I could feel the narrow ends blanketing and squeezing my heart. The pain grew ever more intense, throbbing through my arteries and veins. Just as my limbs fell numb, I heard a faint voice. "We're a new one, my lords," it said. "He is young and strong, this one, a man of the forest. He will serve you well." And all fell silent. Waking was bittersweet. I gulped deep lungfuls of air in shock. Breathing so quickly made my head spin and my heart pound, but I didn't care. Each sweet breath warned me to never take life for granted again, and I wouldn't. I stretched my limbs and flexed my digits, and I sighed as I felt the blood flow through them once more. Thank God it was only a nightmare. It was a horror I hoped never to experience again. Yet, despite my relief, I awoke in terrible discomfort. I had gone to sleep hungry, thirsty, and exhausted, and it had grown far worse in the night. My skin had lost its pallor, and I felt lightheaded. My vision had turned hazy. My mouth felt like a sweltering desert, and I was starving. I had never felt so ill in all my life. Most disturbing of all, a curious rash had spread across my chest, violently red and swollen, and it burned like fire. It originated from the point where the dream roots had pierced my flesh. The agony I suffered that night, whatever had caused it, in waking reality, had been real. Had I been in a more stable state of mind, I might have suspected ill intent from the deranged Harrison, but I could think only of my parched throat and the gnawing hunger pains. I could hardly move, and Harrison was nowhere to be found. So I crawled desperately for the door, slowed by my sudden weakness, but I could not stop. The pangs of hunger were relentless. I would have eaten the dead leaves of the forest floor to ease the pain if I had to, and I nearly did just that. I was already holding a crumbling mass to my open mouth before I saw something far more appetizing in the distance. I saw Harrison, just past the trees in another tiny clearing, tending to a small vegetable garden. Behind him sat a basket of crudely woven tree bark containing what appeared to be large, distorted turnips. They looked edible, and that was the only thing that interested me. I rose and scrambled for the clearing faster than I would have thought my ailments would permit. Desperation is our greatest motivator, it seems. All I could see was food, and my aching body would not stand between me and those peculiar vegetables. I tumbled and clumsily overturned the basket, spilling its contents to the muddy patch of their growth. Still, I heard no protest from Harrison, if he was even yet aware of my presence. He seemed much too busy doting over those roots still buried to care. The strange vegetable pulsed in my hands like a feverish heart, and it felt warm, alive in a way no plant should be. But its alien nature did not sway me. I didn't even bother to brush away the mud. I just bit in through the filth, and it released sweet fluid that quenched my burning throat. The husk, rich and succulent, tasted of cooked flesh and the purest goodness of earth. It washed my pain away, made me whole again, and it would sustain me for a time. The sudden relief was overwhelming. It calmed my mind and relaxed my body, and I fell into a more peaceful slumber, though not before catching a blurry glimpse of Harrison's face gazing down at me. He wore a satisfied grin. I awoke in the cabinet, with the last light of dusk spilling through the half-open door. I'd been out for most of the day, and Harrison had apparently carried me. How he even managed to budge me with his waning muscles, I'll never know. In hindsight, I suppose it might not have been him at all, but some other unseen hand. He sat across from me, watching me as he bit into one of the roots that had saved my life. He wore the same grin all the while, munching the life-giving vegetable with yellowing teeth, some broken or missing. He stared into my eyes at length, and he chuckled through a mouthful of the strange turnip. "What's so funny?" I asked, finally able to speak. He chuckled again, and he stared at the rash on my exposed chest. It had turned leathery and thick like a nasty scar. I touched it, and I could swear that it moved beneath my fingertips, however slightly. I recoiled in horror, and his chuckle turned into a full belly laugh, juice dribbling down his chin. I was confused and infuriated. "What in the bloody hell is this?" I demanded. "What's happening to me? What have you done?" "The seed," he murmured. I narrowed my eyes at him, dissatisfied with his answer. He continued, speaking louder this time. "They planted their seed. Planted it there." He pointed to the leathery scar with one bony finger. I clutched my chest with a looming sense of dread. "What have you done to me, old man?" I demanded once more, moving to strike him, but I froze as he stood. He gave no reply, only removed the thin garment covering his torso, unveiling a horror I shudder to remember, even now, especially in knowing that one day my fate will be the same. His body, withered as it had become, was covered in the same leathery scars. They wrapped about his distended belly and over his ribs like a menacing talon, much darker than my own, swollen and visibly undulating with parasitic life. Some scars had hardened like bark, some with small fleshy branches, and some hosted flaps of softer skin, not unlike leaves, riddled with inflamed and burst veins, reddened with his lifeblood. "Here, you see," he laughed in madness. "This is the gift I give to you." The sight was too much to bear. My gorge rose and I nearly vomited, but he shouted at me furiously, "No, you mustn't waste the feeding root. They gave it to you. You will be grateful." I swallowed hard. A cold sweat glazed my skin as I beheld his grotesque form. What are you?" I stammered. A menacing smile crept across his lips. "I am ascended, boy. Evolved. I eat of the root every day that they might grow. I tended to my masters in their need, keep them safe and hearty. I give them my flesh, and soon I will join them. I will become one of their elder trees. This is my reward." I gasped a series of deep, panicked breaths. "You call this a reward?" I tried to calm myself and gather my thoughts. "What is this place? What are they? Why are they bring me here?" "They need you." "Need me for what? Why me?" "They will tell you. You will hear them soon." I grew tired of his cryptic nonsense. "Well, I want no part of it. I just want to go home." "Don't you see?" He gestured to our surroundings, the forest clearing and the cabin. "This is your home, your new home. You've been chosen." I wouldn't hear another word of it. I gathered all of my strength and ran for the door, threw it open in a rage, and sprinted blindly into the woods. "You've nowhere to run," he called after me. "They'll not let you leave." I ignored his warning. Nothing could keep me there. Not if I could help it. Nettles and twigs stung my bare feet with every step. Bare bushes left me covered in cuts and scrapes. I had no idea where I was going, but I didn't care. I only wished to put as much distance between me and that horrible place as possible. I would not be their prisoner. I ran through the night, even through total darkness. It wasn't until I tripped for the third time and sprained my ankle that I finally stopped. I fully expected the imps, or something more terrifying, to pounce on me and drag me back to the clearing. They didn't. They didn't need to, I soon learned. As I stubbornly crawled even further into the forest, just as Harrison said, the voices finally caught up to me. Or perhaps it would be inaccurate to call them voices. They used no words, only expressed the force of their will with demanding aches in my head. They needn't have spoken, for I understood them all the same. They were the trees, the oldest and wisest of them. The elders. They called for my return, and their fury stirred the scar upon my chest. I could feel it writhing, much stronger than before, and it made a noise, a diminutive whine. I could feel it tightening around my heart in anger. I rolled about in agony, clutched my chest, and begged it to stop. It wanted to eat me again, to feed it, and its hunger was ravenous. Just when I thought it would kill me, it loosened its grip and allowed me to move, but the voices never ceased. I had no idea what I could do. I desperately brushed my hands through the leaves and dirt in the dark. Surely there had to be something I could eat, something to quiet the stirring of the parasite. At last, I found a small scattering of berries. They might have been poisonous, but I took my chances. I filled my mouth to capacity as fast as I could, and my jaw ached as I chewed and swallowed too quickly. I sighed with relief, certain that I quelled the hunger of the seed in my chest. However, only moments after I swallowed, the juices and pulp came spewing forth from my throat and onto the dry leaves. The berries hadn't even reached my stomach before they were ejected, and the voices in my head sounded once more. "The root," they said, and the parasite gave one more nourishing, breath-stealing squeeze. The parasite would only accept the root that sated it before, and that's when I understood. This thing in my chest, this seed, was no gift at all. It was a leash. I had never seen that strange vegetable before my time in the clearing, and I suspected I would find it nowhere else. Doubtless they grew only at the feet of the elder trees. I would have died that night had I not stumbled upon a small stream, the first I had ever come across since I left my home months before. Perhaps I thought it was the water source that fed the root patch, and I could safely assume that my captors agreed as the pain in my chest and the voices in my head began to subside as I followed it to the south. I followed its winding trail until morning, and it led me faithfully to the patch, where I gorged myself on my only available relief. Through mouthfuls and short breaths, I looked around in sorrow at my prison, defeated. The seed was within me now, and I could survive nowhere else. Of course, Harrison knew this all too well, so it was no surprise to find him waiting for me. "You cannot leave, boy," he gravely declared as he trudged toward me through the mud. "Your old life is over. You serve us now." I could give no reply. I knew he was right, and I despaired. Just as I finished off the route, the voices called again. Louder this time, and Harrison heard them too. The largest of the trees groaned, and they seemed to lean inward toward him, almost as if bowing in respect. "It is time!" he exclaimed. "At last! Oh, how I've waited for this day! Thank you, my lords!" I watched as great roots rose from the soil and wrapped about his legs, climbed his body, and pierced between his ribs. His pain was obvious, and yet he laughed through the blood pooling in his mouth, giving thanks until his last breath. Before long, he fell still and silent. His glassy eyes focused on mine as the last of the roots sealed him in a wooden cocoon and dragged him beneath the soil. It was the strangest, most frightening thing I had ever witnessed. Soon he was gone forever, and I was left alone to contemplate my fate. That night, as I rested on the nearly vacant bed of grass, I heard from him one last time, speaking with a wordless force of will, the same as the elder trees. These were his parting words to me. "Service. Care for us as I cared for them before you. Here you will have all you will need. Serve us well, and in death, live forever among us." That was 25 years ago, and I have lived here alone ever since. I keep the elders healthy. I tend the saplings and the feeding roots, and I sate the seed in my chest to live. I am the tree keeper, just as many before me. And one day some unwitting child will take my place. Over time, the trees will take back the forest. They will take the dwellings of men, and we can only hope they will spare us, if only to serve them. Until then, I will give them my flesh and labor, and to feed the seed that will preserve my soul in ancient wood.
The estate was opulent, a palace among mere mansions. Yet to Chelsea Blackbourne, it was a miserable prison of boredom and routine, grand, yet familiar, and familiarity bred contempt. The manor was evidence of the great wealth and privilege that had once belonged to the Blackbourne family, a lifestyle Chelsea had never known. It had been nearly a century since the clan had been truly prominent. Even Chelsea's father had not experienced the majestic heyday of the family legacy. Unlike their ancestors, they had never been invited to balls or galas. They existed in the shadows of excess, devoid of the pleasures of extravagance that the house portrayed. It had high ceilings and winding staircases, thick stone walls and grand fireplaces, dozens of rooms and quarters for servants, spaces that were now empty. The manor's decor was aging, yet lavish, which enabled the house to maintain its dignity despite its present owner's problematic financial circumstances. Chelsea roamed the halls, covered by lush Persian carpets and lit by glass chandeliers that glowed golden. There were dozens of oil paintings, mostly portraits of well-dressed and long-dead relatives, and intricately carved wooden furniture that would last for centuries. There had once been considerable quantities of jewelry, silverware, and porcelain, but the majority had been sold over the past 50 years. Now all the remaining treasures were in the attic, a place Chelsea was barred from, but infiltrated whenever she could. Chelsea's father, Henry, inherited the mansion and the acres of land it stood upon from his Uncle George. George, an eccentric bachelor, had lived his life in the lap of luxury and spent his fortune traveling to far-off locations like Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, where he had amassed various artifacts. Uncle George, a private person, built a huge stone wall around the grounds and ensured that there was only one entrance into the premises, which was guarded by a wrought iron gate painted the darkest shade of black. Throughout his life, he embarked on his own adventures and shirked all traditional rules. Chelsea had never met her Uncle George. He died before her parents were married, but she assumed that he had been completely bonkers. To his credit,
He hadn't been responsible for any of the terrible investments that had ultimately bankrupted the Blackbournes. In fact, Uncle George had been quite the businessman. He created a business out of his assorted oddities collection by opening and operating an antique shop in the city's downtown. Of course, most downtown dwellers couldn't afford to buy anything, so George changed tactics. He turned the shop into a curiosities museum and charged the public admission to enter. When George passed away, he had left all his worldly goods to his favorite nephew, Henry. Henry had been cared for by George since the age of 16, after his father committed suicide, and his mother had a nervous breakdown. Insanity, Chelsea noted, plagued all the Blackbourne women. Even her mother Agatha, who had married into the family, hadn't been quite right. Apparently, mental instability attracted Blackbourne men. Motherhood hadn't suited Agatha. The scarce memories Chelsea had of her were not fond ones. When Chelsea was 3, Agatha had fallen off the roof, to her death. At least, that was what Henry said. Now older and wiser at age 11, Chelsea strongly suspected that her mother had purposefully thrown herself down, wishing to die. Agatha's death had turned Henry cold and standoffish. Chelsea, meanwhile, hadn't been dismayed. They hadn't liked each other, and so she had no reason to mourn her mother's passing. Since then, Chelsea spent her days confined to the house or languishing in its sizable gardens, as her father locked himself in the study. Her only company was her tutor, Miss Iverson, and Sarah, the wretched maid. Chelsea utterly disliked dowdy old Miss Iverson, who constantly pestered her to polish her pianist skills, but she outright hated beautiful, perfect Sarah. While Miss Iverson was only the latest in a string of tutors, few lasted long with Chelsea, Sarah had been a near constant presence and enemy for over 4 years. Sarah worked at the estate 3 days a week, and as much as Chelsea tried to ignore her, there was something about the servant that captivated and enraged her. Sarah was 19, and much prettier than Chelsea, which seemed woefully unjust considering that she was also much poorer than Chelsea. In spite of how far the Blackbournes had fallen in high society circles, they were still undeniably privileged. Utterly unlike Sarah, who toiled away as a maid for 3 different households 6 days a week. Once, Chelsea asked where she lived, and the maid confessed to residing in a small row house, cramped with several younger siblings and a sickly mother. Sarah was a pitiful creature burdened with a difficult life. The sole advantage she held over Chelsea was her looks. Sarah was undeniably beautiful, and Chelsea was indescribably jealous. Chelsea had first noticed her unfortunate features at age 10. Prior to that, she hadn't thought much about her pudgy belly, frizzy hair, and buck teeth. She rarely registered her broad nose, too far apart eyes, and dull brown hair, until one day she looked in the mirror and realized that she didn't look anything like the fairies illustrated in her storybooks. Fairies were dainty and delicate. Stubby Chelsea resembled the depictions of witches. Sarah, however, was tall and slim, with long blonde hair and bright blue eyes, the incarnation of loveliness. One day, Chelsea had been in town with her father on a rare outing to the curiosity shop and heard a group of young men whistling and shouting. Several stable boys were desperately vying for the attention of Sarah as she hurried down the street, wicker basket in hand, obviously on an errand. The sight had filled Chelsea with envy. She knew she was too young to be courted, but one day she would be expected to marry. But how was she to marry when she didn't look like Sarah? Moreover, why should some common Sarah be graced with good looks when she, a Blackbourne, was not? It was simply unacceptable. Sarah hadn't as much as glanced in the boy's direction. Clearly, such attention was too common an occurrence to warrant a reaction. Chelsea had never been fond of Sarah, but her indifference turned to loathing after witnessing that scene. She vowed to punish Sarah for her blessed features and tormented her every chance she got. She switched the labels on the salt and pepper shakers. She threw mud on newly washed sheets as they dried on the line. She hid the broom and misplaced the kettle, and when questioned, denied everything. Sarah started avoiding Chelsea, a fact that elated the younger girl and filled her with an intoxicating sense of power. Chelsea felt a similar sense of accomplishment every time she frightened off a tutor. She disliked learning and threw wild tantrums whenever anyone tried to make her sit for a lesson. Her father did nothing to quell her, and the tutors dared not strike her. She was still a Blackborn, after all. So they simply left to find greener pastures, or at least more agreeable students. The same thing happened with the nannies. From age 3 to 7, Chelsea had been burdened with several minders whom she successfully sparred with until her father finally stopped hiring them. Miss Iverson was the sole teacher she hadn't managed to banish. The elderly spinster Miss Iverson always looked after Chelsea whenever her father had an appointment. Henry rarely took Chelsea along with him since she acted up relentlessly and had a tendency to make a spectacle of herself at formal events. Chelsea didn't mind staying in Miss Iverson's care since she had diligently studied plants and herbs and knew precisely how to spike the old woman's tea and make her fall into a long, deep slumber. Whenever Miss Iverson drifted off to sleep, Chelsea seized the opportunity to ascend into the attic. She had even taught herself how to pick locks solely for the purpose of exploring it. Chelsea was inexplicably enticed by the attic. It was as if something inside of it called out to her incessantly. She liked its dim light and its musty smell. She liked the sight of cobwebs and dust. Mostly, she was fascinated by the masses of objects stacked on top of each other, all things from Uncle George's collection that had not been selected for display at the curiosity shop. Chelsea thought deeply about the treasures. Who were the original owners? How had Uncle George come to possess them? Unanswerable questions, of course, but also divine food for thought. Time drifted idly as she wandered aimlessly among ancient armor and dulled swords, fierce-looking carved masks and oddly fleshy objects in jars filled with yellowed liquids. Chelsea was especially fond of the jars which contained half-formed pigs and eels and cows. One jar even looked as if it held a human baby, although she couldn't imagine how a baby could have possibly ended up in a bottle. She had been rummaging through the attic looking for more jars, or, better yet, papers confirming what they were and where they were from, when she stumbled across the trunk. It was medium-sized, upholstered with aging brown leather, fastened with brass-buckled like locks. It was an unremarkable thing that Chelsea would normally cast aside without a second glance. But something about the trunk pulled her toward it magnetically. She crept closer, unable to take her eyes off it. On a whim, she reached out and touched the lid. As soon as her palm connected with its surface, an odd, dizzying feeling came over her, as if she was being lifted out of her body, while another presence entered her head. Chelsea was aware that the voice was in her mind, but somehow it also seemed to be emanating from inside the trunk. Her sudden intense urge to carry the trunk down 3 flights of stairs and into the garden seemed ludicrous considering that it was nearly as big as she was. Yet, apparently, the chest was lightweight, because the next thing Chelsea knew, she was sitting on the garden's lush, overgrown grass, under her beloved hemlock trees, fiddling with the trunk's locks. Strangely, she had no memory of actually carrying it downstairs, or of leaving the attic. The final lock came undone with a snap, and Chelsea eagerly lifted the lid. She was instantly overcome by a thick, grayish-white cloud. At first she thought it was dust or smoke, but it had a strangely intoxicating aroma that was both timeless and exotic. It was like no other scent she had ever known. Then, with a sound somewhere between a gasp and a yawn, a lithe creature arose from the confines of the trunk. Its body was white, yet vapid, like a ghost, although it better resembled an insect than a human. It had long, spindly limbs, arms, legs, fingers, and large black eyes. Its nose was non-existent, its mouth merely a small straight line near the bottom of its oval head. It had no hair or clothes. Its gender was indeterminable. Chelsea stumbled backwards, but excitement quickly overcame her initial fear. She had read books about these creatures before, and although they traditionally emerged from sealed, fancy bottles, it could only be one thing: a genie. "You've got to grant me 3 wishes," Chelsea shouted at the creature. "I am entitled to 3 wishes." The creature cocked its head to the side, examining her. "I said," Chelsea continued, but then the being spoke.
"I heard you, small one. But I do not understand why you want only 3 wishes. You could have so much more."
Chelsea's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" she inquired. The creature stretched.
"You freed me. I've been in there for ages. I must show my gratitude."
"Good. I want a new music box, a gold one inlaid with diamonds and pearls."
"But that's not what you truly desire, now is it?"
the creature challenged. "Of course it is," Chelsea spat. "I wouldn't have asked for it otherwise."
Material things may be pretty, but getting your way is so much more satisfying. Don't you think?
Crooned the creature.
I specialize in fate. If you want something to happen, I can assist you.
Chelsea stared at the creature wordlessly, intrigued.
If you let me live in your lush garden, I can help you with all your problems,
the creature explained.
My advice is golden, and my magic is potent. I can help you with all that ails you, but my presence must be our secret. You wouldn't want to share my attentions, now would you?
Chelsea vigorously shook her head.
My remaining request is that you bring me food, preferably meat. I don't eat much, but when I'm hungry, I'm ravenous.
Chelsea skeptically considered the offer. "Tell me this," she tested. How do I rid myself of my tutor? I'm tired of her, and I want my father to fire her at once. The creature's mouth twisted upwards in a sinister grin.
That's easy,
it replied.
Spread rumors about her. Tarnish her supposedly pristine reputation. Tell your father that she's aging, and she is starting to disclose scandalous little secrets. Perhaps she had an affair, or two, with men, or boys, or maybe even other ladies. That wouldn't be proper at all, now would it?
Chelsea had never thought about spreading nasty untruths regarding Miss Iverson, but it could certainly work. She was aging, and did mumble on and on from time to time. Who's to say that she couldn't have confessed some dark secrets? And what about that horrid maid? Chelsea hissed. She's even worse. Scurrying around, flaunting her beauty, mocking me with her existence. She must be stopped.
If you really want to punish her, take away her beauty,
the creature replied.
Scarring her face will be a fate worse than death. After all, if you make her lose one of her pretty eyes, she'll have to suffer as an invalid for years, decades, forevermore.
How do I do it? Chelsea pleaded, trembling with glee and amused by the creature's cunning ways. She already felt a strong kinship with it than with any human she had ever known.
I'll guide you,
the creature promised.
I aid those who are loyal to me. Have we a pact?
Chelsea did not hesitate to accept the creature's terms. The next thing Chelsea knew, she was back in the attic, sitting on the floor with the trunk in its original position. She didn't remember bringing it upstairs or pushing it back into place. It was as if she had done so in a trance. A sudden wave of sorrow washed over her. It was all nothing more than a daydream. Yet, when Chelsea glanced out the attic window, she was elated to see the oddly elegant creature coiling itself around the branches of the hemlock trees. A dream it was not. Within a week, Miss Iverson was fired. Henry had been horrified by his daughter's accusations of the tutor's unladylike behavior, especially when Chelsea told him about how Miss Iverson had caressed her. Needless to say, the old woman was not provided with a reference. Yet, the ultimate glory came 3 days later, when the hated Sarah was finally permanently marred. Following the creature's advice, Chelsea tightened all the piano strings and partially cut several with a kitchen knife. Then she ordered the maid to dust inside the piano. As soon as Sarah opened the cover, the steel strings popped off and slashed her face. Her screams were music to Chelsea's ears. There had been a lot of blood. Sarah's right eye was completely ruined, and the skin across most of her face was covered with deep gashes that would definitely leave lifelong marks. Sarah had spent weeks in the hospital, stitched up like a rag doll, and never returned to work. Several months after the maiming, Chelsea had spotted Sarah in town walking, with a black veil over her face to conceal her disfigurement. Young men stood on the corner, yet not one whistled, clapped, or called. Chelsea was pleased. Over time, Chelsea learned the creature's name, Jinnu, and accommodated its feeding requirements. During dinners of chicken or steak, prepared by the new housekeeper, a quiet woman who was neither beautiful nor bothersome, Chelsea saved some morsels and sneaked them out to Jinnu. Neither her father nor the new maid ever complained, which was good, since anyone who annoyed Chelsea was guaranteed to meet with misfortune. Jinnu's presence ensured that Chelsea always got whatever she wanted. After feigning trauma from the alleged assault of Miss Iverson, Chelsea convinced her father that she was educated enough for a girl of her status. Without any scheduled activities, Chelsea spent her days learning how to mix potions to rid her of pimples and to straighten her frizzy hair. Jinnu was quite satisfied in the garden. The creature nested in the darkest portion of shrubbery, hidden away among the hemlock trees and poison ivy, and built an elaborate nest by weaving silky white tendrils together, creating a web, just as spiders did. It was also eating more. When the leftover scraps were no longer enough, Chelsea started capturing birds, squirrels, rabbits, and the occasional stray cat for the creature to dine upon. The massive grounds of the Blackbourne estate were unkempt since the family no longer had the means to afford the gardeners that the property required. Due to the wild and undisturbed conditions of the land, Chelsea was utterly shocked when her father managed to catch a glimpse of Jinnu one day, several years after its arrival. Henry had been pacing around the grounds, worried about the cost of Curiosity Shop's rent. He got too near to the hemlock trees and spotted Jinnu slithering around the upper branches. Henry Blackbourne screamed and ran into the house, hysterically ranting about snakes. Chelsea found him in the living room, searching for his old Crimean war sword, fully intending to slay the creature in the trees. She calmed him and accompanied him back to the garden and eventually convinced him that there was nothing there. Yet, Henry remained suspicious and continued searching around the garden. So, Chelsea decided that he had to go. Chelsea fixed him tea laced with cyanide and told the doctors that he had died in his sleep.
Child.
There was no reason to be suspicious. Henry was aging, and financial stresses often weakened older men's hearts. Chelsea, being of legal age, inherited the entire estate. She felt no qualms about what she had done, since she had done it on behalf of Jinnu. After all, the creature doted on her far more than her father ever had. Once named the proprietor of the estate, Chelsea promptly sold the Curiosity Shop and its remaining items. She fired the housekeeper and lived like a hermit off her dwindling inheritance. She took up gardening zealously, planting additional hemlock and spindly trees, along with deadly flowers such as foxglove, ragwort, oleander, and yellow jessamine. She even started a makeshift greenhouse in an upstairs bedroom, cultivating Venus flytraps and other assorted poisonous vegetation, until the house was surrounded by a prism of colors. Sometimes it seemed like the garden was enchanted, alive. Trees whispered, petals snapped, vines coiled, and roots twisted and pulled. In her spare time, Chelsea explored Uncle George's library. He had collected books about uncommon yet fascinating subjects. Histories of wars and dead languages, medieval medical practices, instructions on potions and spells. One book regarding human escapades with supposedly mythical beings included an illustration that claimed to depict a Middle Eastern knight slaying evil jinn, dark forms of genies, somewhat akin to Jinnu. Below the artwork read the caption, "Imam Ali conquers jinn, unknown artist, 1568. Chelsea paid it no mind. Time ticked by. Its rules non-applicable on the Blackbourne property. Chelsea never seemed to age a day over 30. But Jinnu grew bigger and hungrier and unable to hunt efficiently on its own, depended on Chelsea. She started traveling to the poor side of town at night, frequenting the dingiest pubs and the shabbiest inns to prey on the rabble of society. Initially, she pretended to be a charity worker and tricked working girls, destitute widows, and hapless orphans into following her home, where Jinnu feasted upon them. Authorities never came to the estate asking questions. The poor were seldom missed. During the course of her rare interactions with other people, Chelsea came to the realization that she was no longer the plain, borderline ugly child she had once been. She subsequently learned how to use her beauty to woo men back to the estate. At first, such seductions had been risky, as only the true dregs of society, like men newly released from prison, would accept such an improper offer. However, with each additional trip into town, such propositions were met with increasing ease. Apparently, the decency of the commoners was being eroded at an astounding pace. Chelsea wasn't sure exactly how many times a year Jinnu had to eat. The creature simply got hungry when it got hungry. Gradually, Chelsea learned its meals were extremely infrequent, occurring every few years, perhaps every few decades. She supposed it was possible that a human body could fill Jinnu up for thousands of days, just as a large rat would fill a snake for months. All the clocks on the estate had long since stopped working, and time was a riddle. But indications of change abounded whenever Chelsea ventured into the village. On one trip, she would spy a newly constructed building, and on the next, the same building would be decrepit with age, as if it was still there at all. The fashions changed even more dramatically. Topcoats and corsets turned into casual suits and sequined dresses, then blue jeans and poodle skirts, followed by bright, obnoxious colors that Chelsea heard referred to as tie-dye. That changed to pastels and black leather jackets worn by men and women with enormous hairstyles. Next, men paraded around in baggy pants, and women stuffed themselves into impossibly tight jeans. Chelsea was not a fan of any of these styles, but she made sure to occasionally entice a female victim back to Jinnu's lair, merely to acquire clothing in which to blend into the crowds. Yet, no matter what she wore, her outfits always seemed to be slightly dated each time she exited her estate. Another telling sign of the passing time was the gadgets that the villagers used. The days of horses and carriages had morphed into a world full of cars, radios, and loud blaring boxes called televisions. Most recently, people walked around staring at small rectangles of light that they held in their hands. Sometimes they even spoke to them. Chelsea hadn't the slightest idea what these devices actually did, but they were called phones, and most people seemed quite reliant on them. Although Chelsea shunned most technological advances, on one fairly recent trip, she acquired a brand new Bakelite radio. and she took great pleasure in dancing to the music known as jazz. Of course, every time she switched the radio on, the stations were different, as if the programming changed overnight. What was the value of one night in the mansion to the outside world? A year? A decade? A century? Chelsea couldn't say. She lived to amuse the creature. She sang and danced for it, and in return it kept her young and vital. After years of listening to Jinnu speak of the sumptuousness of human flesh, Chelsea decided to sample it, and quickly named it her favorite meat. She took to joining Jinnu in its meals, devouring everything but the bones, which she used to decorate the manor's interior. She was especially fond of human skulls. Eventually, Chelsea was forced to alter her hunting methods. The new world was full of security cameras, and it was no longer easy to quietly obtain victims. Jinnu knew exactly how to change tactics. The creature convinced Chelsea to start rumors around town about the Blackbourne estate being haunted by the spirits of mentally ill persons. It was a silly, juvenile story, but it was also the stuff of urban legends. Chelsea assumed the fictitious tale would catch on like wildfire. And she was right. Approximately 2 weeks after Chelsea's latest visit to town, which would have been as much as 2 decades in the outside world, 4 teenagers scaled the fence and stormed the garden like Vikings set on pillaging a village. It was a dark, moonless night, and the uninvited guests blindly stumbled through the tall, untamed grass, shouting and giggling and reeking of alcohol. They were all holding their phones, but technology was useless on the Blackbourne estate. The entire group cursed their blank, unresponsive screens. None of them saw Chelsea coming until it was too late. She swept down upon them like a storm, expertly dispatching all of the bodies in seconds before they could so much as scream. Jinnu and Chelsea both ate well that evening. Chelsea supposed that she would have to purchase a freezer to store excess meat, since she assumed their meals would be coming to them quite regularly in the future. She assumed wrong. Chelsea was entirely unaware of the emergence of social media, and this ignorance proved to be her downfall. 4 teenagers vanishing at the same time raised alarms throughout the village. When the police checked the missing youth's web pages, they discovered that the group had been planning a trip to the long-abandoned Blackbourne estate. Approximately 12 hours after the teens' disappearance, a police search party descended upon the mansion. Chelsea had been asleep in her bed, belly full and satisfied, when she was jolted awake by the sound of the intruders cutting through the locked wrought iron gate. She glanced out her window, saw the flashing lights, and heard several voices speaking in tense tones. Extreme fear immediately seized her. The plebeians were breaking in, perhaps intending to riot or loot. Maybe the world is at war again, Chelsea thought as she ran to the garden. Her panic was palpable as she imagined the villagers' discovery of the array of bones placed throughout her home. Jinnu was resting, hibernating, in its shroud-like cocoon, which glistened silver against the dark green branches of hemlock. In desperation, Chelsea violently shook the web. Jinnu awoke, hissing furiously. "Commoners are storming the grounds!" Chelsea wailed. "Too many for me to slay! Protect me!" For several moments, Jinnu remained still and stared at Chelsea, studying her. Finally, it beckoned her with its long, limber fingers. Chelsea had never entered the creature's nest before, but she eagerly crawled in, surprised to discover that the dwelling was warm and cozy, more like a tent than a web. Chelsea was starting to relax when Jinnu turned to face her. Its eyes were black and cold and utterly merciless.
Our pact is resolved,
It hissed, and promptly attached its gaping mouth to Chelsea's pale neck. Jinnu knew its survival depended on disguising itself amid the treetops and waiting for the chaos to subside. It summoned all of its energy and moved away from its silky nest, knowing full well that it would be difficult to find such cushy accommodations ever again. All of its human keepers, slaves, eventually faltered and had to be destroyed. But Chelsea had been the cleverest and longest-lasting of all its caretakers. Ironic, considering that Jinnu had initially been disappointed by how young and small she was. It had greatly underestimated the girl. That Chelsea was rotten deep within her core made her rare amongst humans, but indescribably useful to beings of Jinnu's ilk. The creature knew it would be fortunate to ever master another such host, but it also knew that it needed to start looking. As soon as the humans saw the conditions inside the manor, they were likely to have the building condemned. Remaining in the garden was simply not an option. Jinnu crept along the tree branches, staying close to the estate walls. It slithered toward the back of the garden, where the overgrown shrubbery was thickest, knowing that it could probably climb over that section of the wall, undetected if need be. Suddenly, Jinnu heard voices.
I can't imagine what they found.
That place is an enigma.
I'd love to see the garden, though. It's probably the only private property in the county with more plants than mine.
This statement piqued Jinnu's interest. The creature hailed originally from a land of sand and heat, an abhorrent environment which it had no fond memories of. It much preferred greenery and gardens. Jinnu peered over the wall and saw a man and a woman. Both were holding cameras and standing beside cars. The trunk of the man's car was ajar. As soon as they looked away from the wall, Jinnu snatched the opportunity. It hurried over the stone barrier and slunk into the invitingly dark trunk. A few minutes later, the man bid the woman goodbye, placing its camera in the trunk, and shut the lid. He was completely unaware of the presence of Jinnu, lurking in the back corner. This pleased the creature. It would wait for the man to pop open the trunk. Then, they would make a deal.
It squirmed like a toad pierced with a pointed fire stick. Looking back through clear skies, as a kid, I found his ways too complicated to understand. Why had great-grandfather placed the bones on his barbed wire fence over the top of the hill behind the farm? He fastened and hung the bones of coyotes over the barbed strands. Initially, he said it was to frighten the marauding coyotes away. As we all know, the trickster coyote is going to go anywhere it pleases. I named his hill Skeleton Hill. Oh, it was always there, once benign, the barbed wire fence. Great-grandfather's father built it with thick cedar post. It kept maybe 5 or 6 heads of cattle from wandering off his ancestral grounds. I guess that most of our tribe never thought of building such a fence, especially if the objective was to keep the coyotes at bay. This was great-grandfather's scheme. Maidu reveres coyotes. I had a lot to learn, and they taught me, including how adults bargain with loss and guilt. Great-grandmother loved her coyotes, even after they killed her best egg-laying hen. Over time, they took her snow goose too, leaving its bloodied head. Hell, they stole her best friend Zuzi, the imperial farm cat. Oh. Zuzi would wrap her tail up your leg. Still, great-grandmother never spoke unkindly of the coyote.
Honey, creatures are all hungry, for one thing or another. It's part of the cosmic way. This death thing. This afterlife. We all must play it if we are to remain part of the earth.
I'm Tobias, and I'm half Maidu. The half that knows why the moon and sun dance together. Back then, when I was very young, I didn't know what the hell great-grandmother was talking about. I shook my head, yes, just to keep from looking stupid and having to speak. I used to chop up words pretty well. My few friends said my words sounded crowded, as if they came out of a Vitamix blender. I called what I did when I was excited or anxious a straight-up stutter. I prefer thinking in black and white that way. And so, when I was back in Oakland during elementary school, I did some coyote fence research. We lived in Vallejo, but Mom wanted to keep me close to the school where she taught. I think it had something to do about having her eyes on me. I camped out in the old school library. Alone, in a corner. Corners and loneliness have a lot in common. Both involve isolation. And so, I studied a lot about coyotes. They sprinkle our mythology and folklore, our folklore of the great North American plains in California. The shamans created coyotes as the kings and queens of existence, gods with fur coats. It was long before modern culture turned self-absorption and narcissism into required traits to determine royalty based on popularity. Over the millennium, coyotes have taught us so much about love and heartache, magic and gluttony. They are consummate tricksters. Oh, do I love the trickster part of them. They're smart, and they can get away with anything. There were many celebrated tales I read about and enjoyed in Oakland at that musky library. One in particular caught my eye and has stayed with me. It was the one about how a pack of beloved coyotes had brought the shadow of death to a respected village elder, a female shaman. The tale explained how this older woman tended to her garden, kept livestock, and how she dearly loved the wildness of the coyote spirit. How she tolerated their dirty, pawed exploits because of how honest they were. This story was exactly like my great-grandmother's story. It was a tale about how this saintly woman had gotten older and how her beloved coyotes began to visit her more often as she aged. In fact, by the time she passed away from what was thought to be cancer, she was surrounded by footprints of ghostly coyotes at the edge of her beloved garden. There were thousands and thousands of coyotes that had come to pay their last respect. It was difficult to imagine the story I read was fiction. The villagers had placed the elder on top of these tall poles. They used wooden ladders. The poles acted as stilts for the shaman's fleshy, thatched coffin. The coffin was constructed using dry fir and pine limbs. Rosemary and fennel were sprinkled over all of the death, but lightly to calm the winds along her path. They prepared her by wrapping her tightly in woolen blankets. They mummified her head with a ceremonial shawl, and the shawl was intended to display her beauty throughout eternity. The story concluded by explaining why and how each family member was allowed to wrap her earthly possessions into the folds of her garments and her wrinkled body. It wasn't until decades later that new generations of coyotes stopped all the yelping and howling when the aerial burial site fell to the ground. The crash was no more than a mile away from the village. Legend has it that once the coyotes scampered amongst her bones, they grew calm. Relieved and tranquil, they ceased their mourning. When great-grandmother died from cancer, great-grandfather buried her in a shallow grave near Yellow Creek. There was no ceremony, just a lot of shoveling and tossing of dirt. It was a shallow grave, maybe 2 feet deep, next to this creek that was the color of the sun. The earth was damp and thick, meant to preserve her bones. Over time, as I researched more about our customs, the less I truly understood. In fact, I became more and more confused. I think all the complicated stuff around the ceremony of death is meant to distract us away from how we truly feel inside. In that sense, religion keeps us busy. And for the lucky, that is a blessing. I wasn't so fortunate concerning great-grandmother's death. There were too many unanswered questions. Coyotes are very popular figures in native culture. Over millennia, they have refined their role as schemers and self-serving tricksters. Coyotes are known for their ability to stir up a hell of a lot of trouble, testing and violating the moral precepts of humanity. I think that's a good thing. I remind myself of this when I choose the flesh over vegetables. Many among us agree that coyotes, or at least their projected constructs, allow us an easy escape from social restrictions. That is, unless a good comeuppance for their misbehavior is in order. It's only then that their true devilish intentions are exposed. And yet, we love our furry philosophers, the distractors that create anxiety in us as we confront such concepts as life and death. I've always struggled with such things, giving and taking. At the very least, I bargained away, reasoning why my great-grandfather maintained his beloved skeleton fence. I simply assumed his display kept a shitload of guilt and loss from entering his soul. When you're young, the elders assume they can hide things from you quite easily. In part, because of all the wonders in the world, every child appears easily distracted. This is partially true, because real learning requires a certain level of distraction and detachment. Distraction doesn't always mean that we're not paying attention. There were times great-grandfather attempted to distract me away from my mind's eye. It rarely worked. Great-grandfather became compulsive and obsessive about displaying his collection of coyote bones after great-grandmother died. Based on what I observed, he seemed a bit confused about what he was building up there on the tall hill. Was it more of a snare than a deterrent? Was it a perforated attempt to maintain a harmful secret? Or was it meant to keep something from getting out and out of control? Or do we build fences to keep the monsters in us from getting out? As it turned out, the fence became a mystery. Killing the pesky marauders and shaving the meat off their bones involved a systematic process. Sun-bleaching them was more art than science. The method behind great-grandfather's madness seemed obvious. His true intent was more clouded. All this got out of control after great-grandmother died from metastatic cancer. Great-grandfather, a self-proclaimed philosopher, once said he engineered the barbed wire display as an artistic expression, that it was to symbolize the forces of attraction and aversion. Each year he fastened more of the decaying stink, and each summer, when I returned, I observed how an enigma can grow. A murder of crows circled the mountaintop. As a young boy during my stays, there were occasions that I waited for days for great-grandfather to return home from his trek into the Plumas National Forest. The Plumas National Forest rises directly behind the small farm to the north. It's a looming, teal castle of Cascadian wonder. It's the kind of forest that makes you believe anything evil can get lost in there. That frightened the shit out of me. All the nights I waited alone at the farm, dreams weren't complete unless I was swallowed into the darkest conifer corridors. Great-grandfather was a born hunter. It was one of the reasons he often returned to the forest. His buddies in the service had named him the Killer Wolf. Yeah, all dressed up and lethal in his Special Forces camouflage. I imagined great-grandfather conspiring with the darkness that inhabited the Plumas National Forest. Somehow great-grandfather would return by coming down off the face of Skeleton Hill. I assumed wrongly that there would be one less reminder of the pain and guilt he felt for losing his beloved wife for every scavenger he killed. I was certain there was some kind of trade-off, bones for pain, each carcass ensuring his emotional survival. In truth, his superstitious fence was a dam of pathos, filled with more cracks than restraint. The crows pecked at its eyes as if they were black olives left unguarded at a picnic. I'd found a stanky copy of Life magazine in the back of a rarely used drawer in the library in school. It was dated 1937. My friend Jacob and I read this crazy article and combed over the terrible images. The sepia photo showed freshly killed coyotes hanging along a fence line in the state of Texas. A rusted metal sign pinned to this metal gate read, "Every living thing fears death, or should." Ranchers and farmers had used the bone totem carcasses to scare away other pesky ghosts, our ancestral tricksters, Canis latrans. Jacob assured me,
"The practice is less common these days if it exists at all. Maybe in Wyoming or out there in the state of Montana, but not at your great-gramps up at Humbug Valley."
Humbug Valley is where my great-grandfather lived, near the Yellow Creek and the Black Forest. I pulled out my iPhone and showed Jacob a photo of great-grandfather's fence. Jacob's eyes appeared swollen. His pupils expanded as if bike tires about to explode.
"Jesus H. Christ, Toby, that's some scary-ass shit."
Mother and I are headed back up to great-grandfather's small excuse of a ranch. It's actually a small farm where he raises a handful of Angus cattle. In truth, he rarely sells any of them, nor his other livestock, including the incessantly pissing goats. He treats them all like family. He protects them. Not sure why he lives to eradicate all the coyotes. Great-grandmother loved them even after they took her best egg-laying chickens. As usual, the time it takes to get to his place is forever. Time is a long-ass rubber band that stretches out in front of you for miles. Too many miles for kids. You don't even notice it until it snaps back at you. Great-grandfather's ranch, or farm, is about 100 miles east of Yuba City, California. It's up the winding Highway 49, all the way to Plamas County. He lives on a postage stamp parcel of around 40 acres. It backs up to the Plamas National Forest. The trip is a relatively short drive from our bungalow in the city of Vallejo. It's not until Mother turns the old Accord off the pavement and onto the graveled road that we cease our usual banter. For an 11-year-old, I can hold my own in conversations. She's brought up girls, again, these past few trips. It's to determine when she should begin to prepare for the upcoming combat of my teenage years. So far, all the gears of girls are too complicated to line up for this young mechanic. A half-mile up the graveled road, we reach the first gate. This gate is red. Hell's Gate, says the sign. It's how great-grandfather refers to the metal contraption. The gate swings outward toward our car and the main Highway 49. It's located at the same spot where he greets outsiders with a shotgun and gets his mail. Mother brakes the car to a stop some 20 feet in front of it. After I open hell, she drives over the livestock grid. I wait until she passes me, and then I hustle to snap the large padlock in place on Hell's Gate. Then I jump back in the car, and we rocket up the rim of the hill. It's a one-of-a-kind graveled road. From the viewpoint of a drone, straight above us, it looks like a giant fishhook. Great-grandfather says, "Nature and the steep grade designed the damned thing. It was not my crazy idea." The road goes anywhere it wants until it ends. As Mother shifts into low, I peer up at the Henna hillside. From down here, it looms as an arched contour to the top. It's still up there, of course. The rusting barbed wire necklace, the one great-grandfather says he designed to keep the coyotes out. From down here, the barbed thrum appears as a music staff. Fluttering crows dance the windy parallel high wires. Each nervous black crow creates a haunting melody. Each melody a little off-key. We hang on for dear life on the narrow road. The old car appears to ache as we approach the farm. Down the gravity side of the skinny road, the terrain looks like an avalanche waiting to happen. Old rock slides and small trees broken in half. The view is scary as hell, especially up against the passenger door. I do the last thing I ever want to do. I slide next to my mother. Somehow I think this will balance the car out and keep us from tilting off the side of the mountain. As we swoop up and around the curved fishhook, I catch a glimpse of the bleached-out bones up on Skeleton Hill. The fastened ecru glints in the early morning sunlight. Some of the skeletons appear alive in the stiff breeze as they shake and clatter. warning the undead. A stiff wind whisked dusk from under the car's slow-spinning tires. In turn, a cloud covers us in a dirty fog. We slowly meander up the hill, rabbits in a black top hat. We emerge as if magic out of the haze. I'm thankful to be alive as the car is still glued to the ground. In the distance, I'm able to see the Blue Gate. Great-grandfather says,
"The Blue Gate takes care of all the wanted arrivals, family and friends."
It's a contradiction, especially since my great-grandmother's passing. The older man doesn't have any friends. I notice the second gate is open. Great-grandfather built the second gate to swing inward into the farm. It's the one that's welcoming. He calls the Blue Gate Heaven's Gate. Great-grandfather promised me once that most of his memorial fence on the hill was decorated using deceased coyote bones, those that had starved to death or outlived the ability to grow a shiny coat. He once said,
"Most of the coyotes around here have been killed off by the local livestock farmers and ranchers."
Great-grandfather collects the bones, mostly on his trips into the forest.
"It is the one place where the voice of our people is still understood."
I know better. Sometimes he goes off into the woods with only a backpack and his trusty 30-30 Winchester rifle. He says it's to protect him from cougars and bears, but great-grandfather isn't afraid of anything, except for maybe any watchful spirits. He kills deer and wild boar, sticks them in his large freezer. For a day or two at a time during summer visits, he leaves me alone to feed all the animals and irrigate the garden. Great-grandfather says it's one of life's learning experiences. Mother doesn't know it, but sometimes great-grandfather is gone for more than a few days. He loves to explain why he wears the necklace of bones, an owl beak, an otter femur, and of course, his mountain lion's tooth and bear claws.
"It is to protect me from evil, Goose."
Really?
I ask,
What evil?
"Any evil. For Christ's sake, it protected me and Nam, did it not?"
What he leaves out is that he mostly wore his bone necklace in Vietnam to attract the VC.
"Killing has become a big part of me,"
he once said.
"My bone necklace on top of the hill is meant to keep something out."
He fastens the putrid bones using 10-gauge wires that he purchases at Ace.
"Those damned coyotes are going to think twice about coming over onto my land."
That's always seemed odd. Great-grandfather is well aware that his wife loved having them around. Not sure who he thinks he's fooling. I'm certain the fence was built for other reasons.
Blood and entrails drain from its stomach to the ground.
Most of the townfolk in Humbug Valley avoid great-grandfather altogether, even his kinfolk over in Portola. They don't give two shits about his bravery and accomplishments in his wars. They call him names behind his back. Most of his critics are from the Maidu community. They believe he has evil spirits circling his head from a lifetime of indiscretions. Charlie, who's an elder and the storekeeper, knows great-grandfather has hearing loss, that it's mostly from all the Black Op battles overseas and in Vietnam, so he and his friends whisper real low down at the local Ace Hardware. They converse the same way elephants do in the Congo when they don't want you listening in on them.
Hey, look over there. It's Billy. He's with his grandson. His great-grandson, summer vacation. It looks like Billy is continuing to add to his sinister fence up on the hill off 49. He is so damn eccentric. Some say he's crazier than a shithouse rat, just like when he returned from those wars for a spell. Ooh, I feel sorry for his great-grandson. I hope it's not contagious.
Goat never let any of the gossipy folk near his property. He's always been able to understand their conversations. He wants no part of them.
"No worries,"
he says to me.
"I am sure they are afraid I am going to add their bones to my fence."
We both chuckle. Great-grandfather more than me. This is my 4th summer with my great-grandfather. We started summers when I was a little kid, maybe 8. Mother teaches grad school in Oakland. She says the 8 weeks or so that I visit each year allows her some much-needed rest. Those hyperactive school kids and all. At least, That's what she tells her men friends when I'm supposed to be asleep. Since Daddy's gone, and he's always gone, Mother uses a lot of her summers to complete the badly needed repairs on our small house and general maintenance. Summers make her mow our miserable excuse for a lawn in front and back of the house. I'm still too short to start and run the cranky piece of crap mower. Sometimes she gets a man to do it, to mow her lawn. Those poor bastards mow down everything in sight. Usually her sleepovers take place when I'm out of town. She giggles and tells her friends, "They keep my lawn from turning into some kind of urban jungle." Each summer, my mother tells me the same jokes. One, in particular, is about how it might be easier to bale all the weedy grass and call it alfalfa. Then we can rent a truck and sell it to some of the old hippies over in Berkeley for compost or bedding. It kills me every time. As I've gotten older, my take is that she sends me up there for more than charging up her rundown battery. It's also because she wants me to learn some of the man stuff from great-grandfather. She calls me an apprentice medicine man, says I'm good for great-grandfather, and I'm something akin to a human salve for the spirit. Up north, she figures I'll put a big dent in some of his loneliness, as well as my own. She's smart that way. More than rumor has it, my biological dad lives up north too, a little further. He's in this timeshare named Pelican Bay State Penitentiary. He's serving 25 to life for second-degree murder. He shot a man at a bar in Delano, all because the man caught my dad cheating at cards. There's not much I can learn from my father way up there anyway, except to appreciate him not being around. I've concluded that he's a real loser. It's never too young for kids to get acquainted with the truth. We wave goodbye to Mother again as she heads back down to the Bay Area. We do this each summer. As the dust settles, Mother disappears. It's then I help great-grandfather push the long red and blue gate shut. Up here, great-grandfather doesn't think twice about assigning me chores, even the ones I'm not sure I can do. Great-grandfather loves calling his small farm up in the boondocks. Maybe it's because we live in this tiny humbug valley. Or perhaps it's because we live next to the vastness of the Plamas National Forest. By the end of each summer, everything is golden at the base of the hill that borders the non-forest side of the farm. The tall, windy grass, life, late summer corn, the month of August, and the distracting sunsets. It's up here that Mother Nature insists you watch as she spills champagne over the darkening mountains to the west and sunset. Just seeing this makes you drunk and relaxed, almost ready for bed. Summers are chopping firewood, feeding the livestock, and tending to the garden. Great-grandfather laughs as the rototiller bucks me around like a Folsom rodeo bull. He's cool. He lets me sleep all night in his patch of 6 feet tall corn. There, I fashion a place to sleep. I've gotten good at lining all the stars up in rows. Mother would frown on some of our antics, but we've gotten good at keeping them secret. I love feeding the geese, and so my great-grandfather nicknamed me Goose. I call him Goat, not to be mean or anything. It's because he looks like one of his goats, a goat he named Billy No. 2. They both have Fu Manchu whiskers. We talked a lot about things over my long stay, about how growing up is hard these days, and how some of my friends teased me about having a mild stutter, and being Native. I would eventually ditch the stutter, but being Native American was an honor I intended to cherish forever.
Hard times, Goose? Let us take a break from all of the weeding.
Over a couple of iced Pepsis, a cool breeze, and 2 comfortable Adirondack chairs on the back porch, great-grandfather asked,
Goose, tell me more about those hurtful scuffs you are having down there.
I explain that they've given me the name Hiccups because of my occasional stutter.
Hiccups? That is not too bad,
he says with a wry smile.
They could have named you Burp, or Fart, or Mr. Fart Jr.
We both laugh, as if possessed. But the names hurt my feelings, Goat, I say.
I understand, but you will get over that in time, son. Your mom said that started shortly after your father left for prison. The stutter.
I guess.
So, it is deeper than a little stutter, son. in terms of the way it hurts. It is the kind of hurt I felt when your great-grandmother said she was leaving me for good. Excuse me, Goose, I meant to say when your grandmother left me for good.
Mom explained that great-grandmother was slowly dying from this painful death, pancreatic cancer. When she accidentally fell and broke her neck, it was a relief, many thought. Mother said the only way great-grandfather could cope was to spend a lot of time in the forest. He felt guilty about her tripping down the steps of the porch. She lived a month after the oncologist said she would die. Still, great-grandfather felt guilty for some reason. After she died, he retired for good. He said he lost his appetite for everything. It was like when he returned home from all his killing in those battles. Great-grandfather was in special forces in the service. He got promoted up to lieutenant colonel. He traveled to a lot of secret and desperate places over the years. He finished his career as a longshoreman in Vallejo. He said losing her, my great-grandmother, the way that she died, was truly tragic. Every time he brought that up, he looked angry.
When the kids tease me, it hurts. But it's not like losing a loved one. Like when you lost great-grandmother.
I have an easy answer for you, Goose.
Great-grandfather squirmed away from the back of his sticky chair and situated his bony ass on the lip of the seat.
Easy?
I asked.
Yes, easy. When those boys give you grief, just tell them, Goose, that your father has long arms. In fact, his arms are made out of taffy. They already know he is a badass biker. Tell them you certainly do not want anything to happen to them or their lovely family.
What? Jesus sakes, Goat. That's so friggin' random.
Both of us take a hard swig of Pepsi and square up our chins and shoulders. Great-grandfather speaks again, but this time more forcefully. He narrows his green tiger eyes, the kind he used in the jungle.
Next time, let them know you really love the name Tobias. Tell them it was the name your mother gave you, and that Toby is fine. Say, dude, if you insist on calling me anything else, you are going to get the shit kicked out of you. Tell them, one after the other. If that does not work, then let each one know you intend to reach out to your father and his friends.
Oh my God, great-grandfather!
What? Give them a couple of black eyes, son. They deserve it. Shiners. Black eyes, the kind that makes you look like you're a run-over frog. Hot damn, they will not be calling you any more unwanted names, Goose. Rinse and repeat as necessary. Black eyes, bloody noses, you know, a real ass-whooping turnstile.
Great-grandfather's eyes turned into 50 caliber bullet tips. It's as if he was assigned a new undercover mission. Maybe Libya or Kenya. His upper lip curled as if he smelled decay.
Rinse and repeat? Great-grandfather, what happened to the adage, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words shall never hurt me?
That is old school shit, son.
What you are advising is something my crappy father would do.
He is a criminal, yes, but he is also a man, Goose.
Huh. Well, Goat, here's what I was thinking about doing. I'll single one out, a friend, and ask him to choose a name that defines him in a positive light. I'll give him plenty of time, maybe until the end of the day. Once he tells me the cherished name, I'll say to him, well, how would you like to see your name floating in a toilet bowl?
Okay,
says Goat, with his brows pinched closer together. Go on, Goose.
And Papa Goat, if they continue to call me horrible names, then I will just kick the shit out of each and every one of them as needed. Wash, rinse, and repeat. Just like you said.
Great-grandfather blew Pepsi out of both nostrils. I imagined him as a caffeine dragon on steroids. We both howled into the setting sun. When great-grandfather stood up, he slapped his hat on his screeching knee, as if he were putting out a grass fire.
Hey, thanks, Goose. I needed that. That is my grandson. I get it. Diplomacy is the better part of valor, right? I understand as a man, you will not be able to settle everything with your fist as I did.
So when are you gonna take the bones off the fence and, let others get to know you as well as I do?
Goose, thank you for your perspective, but I am not quite ready to share any of my pain. Not just yet. Maybe never. I am certainly not fit to interact with strangers or with anyone I might have pissed off in the past. I have survived this long, not having to be friendly. Plus, it has taken a long time to develop the skill set that allows me to keep others away. It is truly an art. The defensive fence line I have constructed has a purpose in my life. And let us not forget, I have an abundance of guilt and loss to discourage.
Suit yourself, Goat. It's gonna be a long summer.
Just for an instant, it appeared as if the shadows of low-flying crows glossed over great-grandfather's eyes. It was as if he could see into the future, and what he saw was blackness. Our long summer included cooking, campfires, hikes into the mountains, mushroom hunting, fishing the sacred native Yellow Creek, and vegetable farming. Great-grandfather taught me how to become a horse whisperer, though Julius Caesar, the roan stallion, never made it easy for me to ride him bareback. We talked about girls, grades, and fast cars. Nothing was off limits.
Its chest opened up like a dark gill in a black ocean.
I recall one late evening in particular. I jumped into bed to do some Google searches. Great-grandfather peeked around the corner to see how I was doing.
Good, great-grandfather. How about you?
To my surprise, great-grandfather strolled in and plopped on the corner of my bed, as if riding side saddle. He presented me with a certain sadness.
I feel better now, son. To be honest, I had to turn off the television set. They had some ID channel show about this woman who went missing in Cedar Falls, Nebraska. As the story moved forward, the authorities said more than likely she had been murdered. But there was not enough evidence to make an arrest. That is where your great-grandmother Mary was born, Cedar Falls. Goose, that is where her spirit was created.
Goat's eyes swung sideways and up to dam up his tears. His eyes were glossy. He swallowed hard and looked down again.
Oh, I think I get it.
In truth, I didn't know what the hell he was talking about or how to interpret his emotions.
Well, Tobias, it is our secret. I miss your great-grandmother to death. Her dying so young from ovarian cancer was too much to handle.
Great-grandfather, Goat, ovaries are a little above my pay grade. I'm sorry.
I apologize about that, son. Sometimes juggling words allows me to keep bad thoughts out of my head. The bad thoughts remind me of killer coyotes. They will not stop from coming over the hill, Tobias. There is no escaping their bone-chilling howls and sorrowful yelps. It is as if they are pissed off at me about something.
Great-grandfather tapped his forehead.
You have heard them. It is like everything up here wants revenge.
Sorry you feel sad, Goat.
It is not so much sadness, son, but shame and guilt.
Guilt? What do you mean, Goat? For what?
Well, you're 12, son. I should not place such a burden on you. I apologize for that up front. Tobias, I discovered your great-grandmother at the bottom of the porch steps out front. She had collapsed and broken her neck. After the hospice worker arrived, she said your great-grandmother only had 2 weeks to live anyway, so it did not matter. But Toby, she had been wrong dozens of times before.
Wait, I thought she died from cancer.
That is how the Plumas County coroner wrote it up. He was aware that your great-grandmother was going to die sooner or later. The coroner is a gambler, an impatient man. He drinks some. He is easily distracted, and, well, we do not get many dead bodies up here. What killed her was her fall from the top of the steps.
Wow, that's sad, Goat.
Tobias, we argued that day, as I remember. I might have shoved her. I was impatient because she was taking her sweet time, dying and all. I just wanted to move along with my life. But to be honest, Tobias, just because you love someone does not mean they are perfect. Your great-grandmother could be a real witch at times.
Jesus, Goat. I can see why you're upset. I'm sure her fall was an accident. That's what I am going to choose to believe.
I hugged my great-grandfather that night. It was the very first time I'd comforted anyone that way. It felt weird, too adult-like. I was confused about what I heard and tired. But when you love someone bad enough, great-grandmother fell and wasn't pushed, and she was going to die soon anyway. Boys and curiosity often share the same DNA. Before I headed back to Vallejo that summer, while great-grandfather was out on one of his treks, I attempted to climb up Skeleton Hill. It was my first attempt, having been warned by Goat never to climb his hill. After I'd gotten about halfway up the hill, it suddenly clouded over. The end of summer crashed down on me in a torrent of wind and rain. There was a flash flood that barely let me cross. I ended up cold and soaking wet. Before Goat arrived home, I washed and placed my clothes in the dryer. That night, there wasn't a star I couldn't see. I should have known better. Every summer, Goat and I would add to our memories. I was becoming a smaller version of him. In my teens, things got interesting. Great-grandfather Billy Goat had said a few things that had gotten me into trouble at school that fall. It had to do with girls. Mother found the condoms and frowned at great-grandfather and me. As I grew older, I enrolled in college. I soon learned that Goat had saved and paid for most of my education at UC Berkeley. Good and evil can exist together, as they often do. Great-grandfather was a natural-born killer. I certainly had his genetics. Still, I reasoned that if I went to the authorities with great-grandmother's story, I would be handing Billy Goat a death sentence. The feral man of the jungle and now the forest wouldn't last 3 months behind bars. And none of that tattling shit was going to bring great-grandmother Mary back anyway. At least, that's how I convinced myself. I recently spent a weekend up at the ranch in Humbug Valley. It was at the beginning of another glorious spring. I used some vacation time from work to visit Great Gramps. More than a few years had passed. On the weathered and run-down porch, we shared our usual truth serum. A six-pack of Coors quickly helped us grease up our vocal cords. Now that I'd turned 25 and was no longer a teenager, drinking and sharing didn't seem as much fun. Still, we both enjoyed what remained of our time together. We shared a bag of peanuts in our designated Adirondack chairs and the last of great-grandfather's sour green grapes. Goat explained how he missed not having me around as much. He said how sorry he was that his granddaughter, my mother, had passed away so quickly from breast cancer. He cussed out the litter of kids she taught, wanting to blame someone, anyone, for her death. We shed a few salty tears. But he was most curious about my new wife and her extended family. We were all he had left.
You have 2 children, Goose. Why not make it 3? How is your new job, Goose? Are you happy?
Yeah, Goat, I'm happy. I am. But not because of my family. In fact, sometimes the 3 are more of a burden than a blessing. It's not just the responsibility. It's more about the loss of freedom. My wildness, like our wild coyotes.
Chip off the old Lego set.
After a long discussion, Goat asked if he could share some backstory about why he'd placed all the coyote bones along his torturous treason fence line. I just assumed we all reach that intersection in life when we have no excuse to hide anything, especially feelings.
Goose, in my travels, and I have traveled a lot for work and pleasure, as you know, there was this one time that I went down to Old Mexico. I was in the market for an emotional salve for all my guilty feelings.
Interesting. Lay it on me, Great Gramps.
After your great-grandmother died, I was a broken man. I felt guilty to the core of my being. Not much seemed worth living for, including family. While down there, I rented a car and traveled to an outlying village known as Catemaco. I hope you do not take that personally. If so, I am sorry. Catemaco is relatively a small town in the Mexican state of Veracruz. It is a dark place, a mysterious place where the tenets of religion and magic are frequently diced and placed in a blender. It is one of the few places they encourage facts to collide with fables. And so I roamed the streets of this little town as if I were a vagrant in search of answers. I asked around, got directions, and was warned. Eventually, I found myself in this strange merchant shop. It was called Brujeria. Brujeria is the Spanish word for sorcerer.
You're off to a great start, Goat, as usual. Yeah, I'll bite. I'm all in.
It gets better. Listen. When I walked into this shop of horrors, the first thing I noticed was this small doll in a basket on the counter. The shopkeeper was amused
because of how my eyes bugged out over this strange damaged doll for sale. More stitches than skin. He yelled out in perfect English, "You don't want her. She is meant for gossipers."
Gossipers?
That is why the poor, wicked thing in the basket had her lips stitched shut. He cackled louder than a rooster. He said, "Bitch breeze through her nostrils. Hopefully you don't have such a woman in mind. She's always expensive."
Holy shit, Great Gramps, that's some sick shit.
I was desperate, Toby, and open-minded. This guilt shit was killing my soul. I needed direction. I would have considered anything back then. I began to sob and explained how my Zoloft was not fixing my depression, how nagging memories were devouring me in minnow-sized bites. I asked if he would recommend some off-label drugs that would chase away the horrors of insomnia. Maybe cure an evil heart. Anything, really.
Jesus, great-grandfather, you must have felt desperate as hell.
I hope you never experience this, Goose. Catemaco is this go-to small village in Mexico where the Day of the Dead is celebrated every day. Can you believe that? Christ, while in the service, I had not experienced anything like that. Even when I was an invisible killer in Haiti.
I remember all of your pitch black stories about Haiti. And great-grandfather, the dozens and dozens of exterminations. Some still keep me up at night.
Sorry, Tobias. I will get back to my story. In Catemaco, shopkeepers stock their shelves with exotic boxes and bottles of exotic spices. They sell everything down there, mostly for cash. Some were labeled hope and desire, some success, even beauty, Goose. Other prescriptions were placebos for those that want to fool themselves. Really useless for me.
Really? Oh, Great Gramps, did you buy anything?
Yes and no. I scanned the offerings for the longest time before my vision was dragged to another doll. Only this one was life-sized. This ugly thing sat on a black lacquered chair in a corner. You wouldn't think it had eyes unless thick tea-dyed sutures counted. There was an ornate tin cross that had been stuck through its fabric heart. The shopkeeper startled me from a daze. "That ugly corpse of a doll is not for sale, senor. Sorry." He told me instant death was not punishment enough for the evil that doll could envision. And then he giggled. He truly scared the hell out of me, Goose.
He acted as if he could see through me.
Goat, does any of this have to do with Skeleton Hill?
I will get to that, son. Trust me. Kadamako is commonly known as the go-to place for spells and exotic mental and physical cures. The medicines are secondary. Most seeking out this region are interested in spells. The area is referred to as the land of the sorcerers. It is there at that store where I learned about displaying all the coyote bones.
Oh, to each their own, Goat. Who am I to judge?
Still in a dreamlike state, I wandered toward the back of this tiny, sweaty spell shop. I pushed back the star-spackled curtain and entered another smaller room. That shopkeeper followed me. It was there where I was introduced to the mystic. The shopkeeper instructed me to call him that, the mystic. He must have overheard my conversation in the storefront. Anyway, in no time, I was transfixed. I listened to the mystic's instructions carefully at first, but it did not matter. I did not know it then, but he had already placed me under a spell. His speech sounded like multiple tongues, half crackle and half caw, crow-like.
That's some crazy shit, Goat. Wow, you got me in that room with you. Come on, more.
His head and hand movement appeared bizarre. He turned into one of those clowns, the fan clowns you see at car dealerships. Only he had a black cape, and he was flying around the room. My eyes glazed over. It was useless to refocus, Goose. Without blinking, my thoughts traveled the back roads between blindness and the mystic's thoughts. Under this swirling, incandescent light, I was demanded to reveal and relive the most challenging moments of my life right there in that fetid and cramped storage room. It was very difficult, but I did it.
Damn, great-grandfather, that is intense.
It certainly was crazy. By the end of what was a 2-hour session, the mystic programmed my mind on how to display the coyote bones on the skeleton fence. Nail bones to tree, hang bones like totems, string bones along fence. Always keep bones in sight so you have control. Remember, coyotes are non-emotional spirits. It crawled out of my mouth, Goose. I could not help it. I asked the mystic if it would keep great-grandmother's ghost from coming over the hill, since her memories had been completely fused with coyote spirits. No,
you didn't, Goat.
I was so happy when he said yes. I handed out $100 bills to the mystic and to the shopkeeper. I danced, Goose. And as you know, I do not dance for shit. I was reborn until
great-grandfather. Until what?
Until I was tempted to exit the shop without the mystic's final instructions. It was like I had hit a brick wall at the open door. When I spun back around, the mystery shop had turned into a floral shop. I walked back to the counter. At the counter was an old woman with missing teeth. We just stared at each other. Senor, never attempt to hang human remains upon the fence. Otherwise, your entire family will be cursed. Before I attempted to leave again, she handed me a black orchid. Before I left the shop, this time for good, I spun around for the last time. The shop was a vacant storefront. Dead flowers and torn-up fabric were strewn all over the floor. The scent of rat shit perfumed the entire building. I turned and ran into the street and hailed some shitty cab.
Oh my God. My mouth's dry, my heart's thumping. Goat, it's like I was right there with you. Holy shit. Holy smokes. Holy jeez Louise.
So, Goose, I decided that day, upon my return, that I would string out the bones along the fence line at the top of the hill.
Goat points his arthritic index finger up at the side of the mountain behind the farm.
Without control, there's only madness in this world. What I place on the fence, I control.
And now some things are falling into place. Great-grandfather, the red and blue gates, the long twisted barbed wire thrum of the fence, and just, all the bones. It's all about keeping harmful spirits out. It's really not all about scaring off any marauding coyotes.
They say, Goose, whoever you are, that it makes no difference at my age which you let in or keep out of your life. And so, reinventing who I am at this stage is impossible. So, the fence stays. It will not be long, Tobias. I will soon be experiencing my own Day of the Dead. It is not that far off. Right now, I do not have the inclination nor the strength to climb up there and remove those skeletons. Hell, string me up there once I am gone, if you like.
Great-grandfather, why do you say that?
It is because I dishonored your great-grandmother Mary.
I've already forgiven you for that, Goat. That late evening, we bonded over our loneliness, a feeling I rediscovered since losing my mother. Somehow, we understood each other's pain and anger. Great-grandfather had limitations about what he would share, but we did discuss our lives. These missing, dead, unexplainable events haunt most of our dusty pasts. The inexplicable mysteries of Catemaco. There was something about feeling alive that day that made everything seem right, somehow, and worthwhile. It would be our last visit, but I didn't know it at the time.
Evil spirits drained into the stars from the shell of its body.
Not long after the holidays, Great-grandfather's postal carrier phoned. Goat had gone missing at the ranch. Once at the farm, searchers and rescuers followed the circling crows and the infected stench of death into the altitude. They used a welding torch to get through the 2 gates. Great-grandfather was discovered impaled on a branchless cedar tree that resembled a burnt mast on a pirate ship. He was suspended some 20 feet in the air. He only made it 2 miles up Skeleton Hill. It had taken a shotgun blast to scare the feeding crows and scavengers off of his remains, which by then were mostly skull and skin. His exotic juices slurped from under the crusted leather and slowly drizzled down the charcoal tree. Great-grandfather had attempted to climb the steep hill after all. Guilt will do that to you. Apparently, he'd slipped on the loose rock as he attempted to traverse the cliff. The dead cedar had taken dozens of lightning strikes. It lived for 3 whole days, as if meant to be displayed and suffer. I noticed that tree before. It's at the base of this steep wall that usually lifts you to this flat spot of weeds and grass before you're at the fence. It was late summer, the second time I attempted to climb Skeleton Hill. Thunder and lightning appeared out of nowhere. A freak hailstorm had battered me to the ground, preventing me from even getting near the spooky cliffs. Before I'd left for home, I'd promised myself to one day attempt that climb again. Just maybe, Great-grandfather would have felt less guilty had he told the authorities what happened that day at the top of the wooden porch stairs. I considered that he truly enjoyed life, especially his freedom, an alternative to all the misery he created in his mind. I have 2 children now and a wonderful, nagging wife. I don't dare feel sad with such great memories of Goat and my great-grandmother. I have such a glorious future ahead of me without any of them. A few months have passed since he died. Today I'm driving up from San Francisco to look over great-grandfather's place for the last time. More than likely, I'll never be back. The new owners take over in a week. They've asked to keep most of the livestock. In the meantime, the real estate agent is taking care of the animals and selling off the remaining few that weren't wanted. Now that Goat's gone, I chose to disobey him, at least in terms of physicality. I've set aside some time to climb up to the top of Skeleton Hill today, no matter the cost. And when I say hill, it's more like the Torridon Mountains in beautiful Scotland. The Torridons are a series of so-called hills that rise majestically out of the beautiful lowlands. They climb 1,000 feet into the sky. First, I climb through the shadowy treeless valley. The isolated grove of sycamores now leafing from spring, ever upward, over the sharp granite boulders and jagged crags, the ones that eternally glistened like medieval castles from the vantage point of great-grandfather's magical back porch. Before I climb straight up, I notice the charcoal tree now on its side, the one Goat was impaled on. It's taken more lightning strikes to drop it. What appears is rubble and a burnt gunpowder outline destined to dissipate forever in next winter's storms. In a little over 3 hours, I reached the top. At the peak, I can view the golden sun as it obsesses its downing. And so, without haste, I shuffle closer to the barbed wire fence. Stepping over witchweed and spring thistles, I make my way in front of it. From here, my eyes take in the steep barrier's decline in both directions, ever downward. I can see all the way to the broken yellow lines that stitch Highway 49's paved black middle together. On the other side, I see Goat's contoured graveled road, the fishhook. At altitude, the wind finds its voice. It insists on howling and singing the coyote's sad melody. In the folds of the soft side of the breeze is a curse, one that great-grandfather had been warned about. The curse washes over me with the sweet smell of harm and destruction. It's then that I smell the rotting bones. 10-gauge wire threads through tiny holes, hanging femur bones, a pelvis and rib cage, a clavicle and a tail. I catch myself thinking back to anatomy in college. I was taught that humans have 206 bones, while the average dog has around 230, depending on the length of the tail. I look closer. Some of the dried-out flesh appears porcelain, having been licked clean from the wind. There's a skull with a leathery eyeball, dried and stuck to the back of an eye socket. Great-grandmother's head appears frozen in time, her unforgettable smile still hanging there, a limp, tattered leather coin purse with a broken clasp. I can see the gap between her teeth. Patches of her long gray hair whip in a frenzy of uplift. The sticky strands snap and crackle as if hot kindling. Her scent wafts eucalyptus and cinnamon, great-grandmother's favorite. It's the unmistakable scent of anger and annihilation. Up and down the hill, I imagine most of the bones are great-grandmother's, and not those of our trickster coyotes. Over time, I will convince myself none of these are hers, and that the horror and madness of this Macbethian carousel will eventually come to a hard stop. The truth is, Goat and I both knew how much great-grandmother loved her coyotes and all the mischief they brought to her life. We all need that shit. And there is no way great-grandfather would have harmed a single one of those furry bastards. His problems were regarding humans. It's a happy day for all of us, including grandmother. Maybe Goat couldn't stand to see her suffer. It's not up to me to play God and to judge anyone, but murdering her and displaying her, that's another matter. There are other ways to preserve what you hate. At the top of this glorious hill, neither loss nor guilt was kept away nor out. The only magic up here is the remnants of an old man's grief and conscience. I'd like to believe he did what he did because he didn't want to see her suffer. I'll never know for sure. Honestly, it doesn't matter. Who's to judge someone who's eliminated their entire family? Over the years, great-grandfather must have visited her grave near Yellow Creek dozens of times. It's there he dug her up and collected her bones. He sanded them and cleaned them, not so well, by the way. He trekked into the forest and up the long hill. Maybe he thought it would quicken her decay. And once she was completely gone, she couldn't nag and dishonor him anymore. I am fortunate to make it down the other side of the hill, all the way to the graveled road that leads to what used to be great-grandfather's farm. I make it back to my car using spidery braille and an iPhone. I've memorized my way back through the pitchy blackness over time. Well, there is nothing darker than my mind. Once in my car, I drove the long gravel road for the last time. Eventually, I reached the paved Highway 49 and the on-ramp at I-5 near Yuba City. As I bend the car around the long entrance to the freeway toward home, I think I'm fortunate to have known my great-grandparents. Great-grandfather was a complicated, proud man who lived with a special curse. He comforted me when I lost my mother. He more than made up for my invisible father. Most of all, the goat was a damned good great-grandfather. Oh, I will have a lot to live up to one day. My therapist said I was too sentimental, a singular anomaly in all of his 20-odd years of practice. He called me Mr. Goody Two-Shoes. I didn't appreciate any of his unorthodox implosion therapy bullshit. Why is it so important, Tobias, that you always present yourself in the best manner? Why do you insist on acting flawlessly every damned session? Keeping up the facade must be exhausting, he said. By God, I'll show him, I thought. Nobody is perfect. I'm talking about you and your murdering great-grandfather. Have you fashioned a cold-hearted man to appear as a saint? He is a murderer. Hell, Tobias, your whole damned family is evil. The mystic's curse just overwhelmed me. I snapped. Wait, you can't say that about my great-grandfather. He's all I had. You can't destroy or dishonor him in the afterlife. I've had it with this implosion therapy crap. Dr. Cunningham, I am through with you. And all of this, just force yourself to be normal bullshit. Dr. Cunningham accidentally fell off the ledge of his patio apartment in the city 2 weeks after our last session. The newspaper says it was a terrible accident. He was on this step stool, watering the tallest plant. Yeah, I'll miss him. He taught me that the only way to attain internal peace is to merge your inside voice with your outside voice and act as one. Great-grandfather was a counterintuitive thinker like that. He knew damned well I'd climb Skeleton Hill one day, if only to view his Day of the Dead art. His only flaw was his inability to handle the very fragile emotion of guilt. This is the high wire that we sociopaths walk. Bring it on. What I've learned is that pathos is what makes us implicitly human, something we needn't fear or attempt to chase away. Well, at least most of us. And as blind as death can be, sometimes it's helpful to shine a little light along its darkened path. And as far as the subject of guilt goes, I've learned from great-grandfather's mistake. It's impossible to be whole unless you commit to truly being free. Since we're into random shit, hey, listen up. Everything has gotten random lately. My electric bill went through the roof last month. I think it's because of the 2 new coffin freezers in the garage. But Jesus, do they work good. The wife and kids, they love them. I intend to reach for everything in life as nice, quiet, and peaceful as possible. I intend to grasp everything with metacarpal, proximal, middle, and distal digits. I'll use humerus, radius, and ulna bones. It hovered over its great-grandson. It painted on a silly smile.
Tom didn't know how he got here. He remembered stalking the woman through the parking lot, waiting for the right moment to make the grab. Her coach handbag dangled from her elbow as he tagged behind her, pretending to text on his phone to lessen suspicion. He waited until she exited the parking lot onto the busy sidewalk of Broad Street before making his move. He walked up, bumping into her as he slipped the purse off her arm and ran. He remembered hearing her yell as he stepped out onto the street, and then the sound of a horn. Was that a bus? Sounded like a bus. Then everything was quiet. Everything was dark. And now this. Tom was wearing a gray jumpsuit, standing outside of a gray building with no windows on a street lined with buildings of the same design. The street stretched on for miles into the haze in both directions. Above him, the sky was a lighter color gray, filtering the light shining through. "Am I dead?" Tom thought. He took a deep breath, feeling his lungs expand. Could I be breathing if I was dead? Is this really air? Tom walked toward the building. There were no signs, only a revolving door leading to a lobby. He considered walking to one of the other buildings, but they all looked identical. What if this one was his building? After checking the other buildings, he didn't remember which one was his. If he was dead, he didn't want to end up a nameless spirit lost in purgatory because he lost his building. Tom stepped through the revolving door and entered a small lobby leading to a receptionist's window. The walls were bare, except for a single painting of a dog hanging askew. There was a small alcove with a table that had a few magazines on it, all 1970s issues of Sports Illustrated. Tom walked up to the receptionist's window and pressed the buzzer. When the window opened, a small red creature with black horns greeted him. "Jesus!" Tom yelled, stepping back. The creature cocked an eyebrow as it spoke. I get that a lot. Honestly, we don't look a thing like each other. "Where am I? Is this hell?" Tom stuttered, staring at the creature. Besides the red skin and horns, its eyes were all black with no pupils. It was dressed in a forest green blazer that had a name tag clipped to the lapel. Whatever it was, its name was Nibus. The creature was standing on the receptionist's chair in order to reach the window. Tom could see its little cloven hooves digging into the fabric, trying to steady itself as the chair tried to swivel under him. "Didn't the dog tell you?" Nibus said. Tom looked around behind him. "Dog?" Nibus snorted. "Damn it, that dog. Always running about. He's supposed to guard this place. We put one of those invisible fence collars on him, but does he care? No. Just runs right through it. I told them he needed a collar for each head, but procurement wouldn't authorize buying more than one. Just give me a sec, okay?" Nibus plumped back down in his chair and picked up his desk phone and dialed. Lydia? Nibus. Cerberus is loose again. You need to call Thad down, and you need to call Linda. No, you do. Because you're in charge of him. Yes. No. Lydia, he won't listen to me. No. Lydia. When the big guy finds out... Yeah? What's that? Are you serious? How far can he run? Is that really your response right now? We're floating on a lake of fire, Lydia. Just call Thad. Call Thad, Lydia. That's your job. Thank you. Nibus set the phone back in the cradle and stroked one of his horns between his fingertips. I can't deal with this crap today. Nibus sat like that for a few minutes before Tom coughed, reminding him of his presence. Nibus looked up and spoke. Ah, new guy. Yeah, this is hell. Let me pull your file up. Name? Tom cleared his throat, his voice shaking a little. Tom Northrup. Nibus typed his name into the computer. Let's see, new arrivals. There you are. Theft. Lord's name in vain. General crappy behavior. Wow. Got popped by a bus after lifting some old broad's purse. This isn't your day, bub. So that's it? I'm dead? And in hell? Nothing I can do about it now? Tom felt a lump in his throat as his eyes watered. I'm still just a kid. I'm too young to be dead already. I've so much still to do. And Mom? Oh, wow, my poor mother. Oh, boy, we got a crier, Nibus said. Listen, hell isn't so bad. You ever hear the expression that history is written by the victors? Tom nodded, sniffling as he dabbed his eyes with his shirt collar. In a nutshell, that's hell, Nibus continued. The Bible talked this place up like a real butthole, but what else was the big G supposed to do? Had to keep you humies in line, didn't they? Tom took a deep breath and straightened his shirt, his collar damp from wiping his tears. Doesn't matter much now anyways, does it? I'm here. That's the spirit, Nibus said. And look, since it's such a slow intake day, you're going to straight up meet with Satan. I'm meeting Satan? Tom asked, his voice shaking. Nibus nodded. You should be honored. Most humies have to wait a week before they get to meet him. Tom stepped away from the desk, looking back at the revolving door. Don't get any ideas, kid, Nibus said. Outside that door, still hell. Run for 100 miles in any direction, still hell. And on the off chance you do make it to the edge, there's the whole lake of fire you've got to deal with. Runners never make it, and it just pisses everyone off. Don't make me have to call Lydia again. You'd really be busting my balls if you did. Tom gave the door another glance before stepping back to the window. Good call, new guy. Nibus stood back up on his chair and leaned out the window. He handed Tom an envelope. Before you go up, this is your new resident packet. It has your badge in it. That's what you use to get back to your quarters after you meet with Satan. Just put it in the slot in the elevator. It'll do the rest. After he gives you your punishment, a key will update with that information and take you to your punishment site when the time comes. Got it? Tom opened his packet, pulling out his badge that was attached to a lanyard made of braided horsehair. The lanyard's a bit itchy, but this is hell, Nibus said. Just put it in your pocket. No one really cares. This isn't that other place. We're not big on rules. Just don't lose it. Tom stuffed the badge and lanyard in his pocket. The rest of the packet were typical welcome literature, phone list, and a FAQ page. Big guy's ready for you, Nibus said. Step on the elevator and insert your card in the reader. Elevator? Tom asked. There is no. When he turned to look, one of the walls of the lobby had opened up, revealing an open elevator door. Tom stepped into the elevator, which was all black and had no controls other than the card reader. Tom slid his card through it, and the door dinged and closed behind him. Just before the door closed, Nibus called out to him. "You guy, when you meet Satan, be sure to—" The door closed. Be sure to what? Tom thought as the elevator started moving. Up or down, he couldn't tell. The elevator played an instrumental version of We Built This City by Starship. As the elevator moved, the thought occurred to Tom that maybe the elevator was to be his torment. He was claustrophobic. Perhaps he would spend an eternity trapped in an elevator. His breathing quickened and his heart thudded against his ribcage. Or was that just in his mind as the elevator continued in its journey? Just as he was about to brake, Tom heard a ding as the door opened. A great red serpent pushed its head into the opening of the elevator. Its fangs dripped with venom as it looked into Tom's eyes, its tongue darting between the gap in its front teeth. It let out a horrible hiss, causing Tom to cup his hands over his ears and curl into a ball on the floor of the elevator. It spoke in a deep, raspy voice that rattled in Tom's chest and felt like his ears were going to pop. "Welcome to hell," it boomed, followed by maniacal laughter, and then poof, it was gone. Tom looked up from his fetal position to see a humanoid demon with red skin and long black horns pointing at him and laughing. The demon was dressed in a business suit with his hair pulled back in a ponytail. The well-dressed demon almost fell over and was holding himself up against the wall of the elevator, pointing and laughing. "Your face right now," he said in between laughing fits. "Oh my God, that's priceless. You didn't piss your pants, did you? No shame in that, no shame at all." Tom wasn't sure. He looked down and didn't see any wetness, so he shook his head no. "Oh, that's good then. Save you a bit of embarrassment wetting yourself the first time you meet Satan, which is me. Hello." Satan did a half bow. "Then it would be all awkward the next time you saw me. You'd be wondering if I'd be telling everyone that you pissed yourself when you left the room, which I would if you did, but since you didn't, I won't. All right, come on now. Up with you." Satan reached out for Tom to take his hand. "It was just a joke, rather funny one, I might add," Satan said with a beaming grin on his face. Tom reached out and Satan pulled him up to his feet. "In case you were wondering about the snake thing, Revelation 12:9, the great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent who was called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. So it's kind of required. His orders." Satan pointed up, rolling his eyes. "Well, not really. My idea. I get a kick out of it. It's a good icebreaker." Satan led Tom to a seat in front of a giant desk in the middle of the room. Satan sat in the chair on the other side of the desk, leaning forward, his elbows on the desk, as he rested his chin on his fists. "Well, here we are. I'm Satan, and this is hell," Satan said. "And you're—" "Tom Northrop," Tom replied. Satan gasped. "Did you say Tom Northrop?" "Yes." "The Tom Northrop?" I guess so," Tom stuttered. "Oh, wow, this is big, real big. We've been waiting for you." "Really?" Tom asked. Satan nodded. "Oh, yeah, biggest new arrival since Hitler." Tom's jaw dropped. "Me? Really? I wasn't that bad, was I?" "Oh, yeah, we got a huge file on you, Tom," Satan said as he leaned down and lifted a hefty file from the bottom drawer of his desk. "Everything in here says you're a bad dude." Tom was stunned. Sure, he stole a few things and wasn't the nicest person, but was he really that bad? The devil leaned forward, talking just above a whisper. "Want to know what it says about you?" Tom nodded. The devil opened the file, shaking his head and clicking his tongue as he turned the pages. His face shifted from disgust to shock with every turn of the page. "I can't tell you everything in there, for reasons of security. But can I ask you something?" Tom nodded. "What was it like diddling all those puppies?" Tom furrowed his brow. Does it say I did that? Yeah, right here, Satan said, pointing to no page in particular. There must be some sort of mistake. I never, Tom said, but was interrupted by Satan, laughing and smacking his hand against his desk. Got you again, Satan said. He wiped tears of laughter from his cheek. One sizzled as it landed on the desk. You're easy, Tom, if that is your real name. And it is. I know, because I'm Satan and all that. Tom exhaled. Or at least he thought he did. He still wasn't sure about the whole breathing thing. They sat in silence, the devil staring at Tom, smiling. It was an awkward silence. Tom unsure if he should say something or if Satan was just looking him over. Tom glanced around the room, avoiding Satan's gaze. The walls of the office were bare, except for a giant window along the side. Outside, gray buildings stretched for miles in every direction. Off in the distance, the glow of fire rimmed the edge of the buildings. "Do you like boats?" Satan asked. "Boats?" Tom repeated, puzzled by the question. "Yeah, boats. Were you much of a boater in life?" "No, I can't say that I was," Tom answered. "Well, that's too bad," Satan said. "Why?" No reason," Satan said. More silence. Satan picked up a pen and began drawing on the cover of the folder. Tom grew up in a Southern Baptist household, and even though he hadn't been to church since he was 11, he recalled the fiery sermons his pastor gave describing Satan as this great deceiver, liar, and tormentor. Satan was a monster. He devoured souls and tormented them for eternity in a lake of fire. At no point in his Sunday school studies did the devil scribble crude drawings of cats with gigantic penises on a folder. This reminded Tom of what Nibus had told him about hell. History is written by the victors. Maybe Satan was kicked out of heaven because he was annoying, and he was sent to work in the warehouse like he was the retarded son of a wealthy business owner. Then again, maybe none of this was real, and what Tom was experiencing was the last gasp of firing neurons in a dying brain. "So what happens next?" Tom asked, breaking the silence. "Huh? Oh," Satan said, like he almost forgot Tom was sitting in front of him. "Tell me about your life." Tom cleared his throat. "Well, it was pretty normal, I guess. I was born, went to a small school out in the country, graduated high school and went to Duke University." "Blue Devil!" Satan exclaimed. "That's like me, but, you know," Satan gestured to his face. "Blue." Tom nodded. "Yeah, that's the one. My dad went there, so he got me in. I didn't really have the grades or demeanor to succeed. I got mixed up with drugs and flunked out, ended up disowned by my parents and living on the streets. Then the last thing I did when I was alive was steal a lady's purse, ran out into the street in front of a bus, and now I'm here." The devil shook his head. "You were only 23, right?" Tom nodded. "Yes." "Quite a wasted life, isn't it, Tom?" Tom's eyes welled up with tears again. Whether this was real or not didn't matter. He did get hit by the bus and was either dead or dying. "It's not how I wanted things to go. I just got mixed up in the wrong crowd. One thing led to another, and I ended up where I was. It's not how I wanted my life to be, and now it's too late to change anything." Tom was sobbing, burying his head in his hands. "Oh, this is awkward," Satan said. He walked around the desk and stood in front of Tom with his arms outstretched. "Come on, bring it in for a hug." Tom shook his head. "Yeah, I'll be okay." "You sure? Might be the last one you get. This is hell, after all." Satan was smiling, his eyebrows raised as he bounced on his knee, enticing Tom to accept his hug. Tom got the feeling that Satan wasn't going to move until he agreed, so he stood up and leaned in for a hug. Satan squeezed him tight in his arms, stroking Tom's hair. "There you go, buddy," Satan said. "This is too weird," Tom thought as he felt Satan pat his back. and then he heard humming. Tom recognized the song, but he had to be mistaken. There was no way Satan would be humming that song. Tom's certainty of the song was confirmed when Satan began singing the chorus in a soft falsetto, stroking Tom's hair. Hold me closer, tiny dancer. Count the headlights on the highway. Lay me down in sheets of linen. You had a busy day today. Satan released Tom from the hug and looked down at him. How's that? Doing better now? Tom nodded, still a bit dumbfounded by what just happened. After releasing Tom from the hug, Satan returned to his chair. This has to be a dream, Tom thought as he sat back down in his seat. There's no way Satan is this weird, incompetent, lonely, all of the above. So now, Satan began, your assignment. Your eternal damnation for a lifetime of sin. Are you ready for it? Tom took a deep, possibly imaginary breath, then nodded. You can't just nod. You have to say, I'm ready. I'm ready, Tom replied. Satan cleared his throat. Your punishment, Satan began, pausing for dramatic effect after each clause. For all of eternity, which is until the end of time, and then after that, and then even after that, will be pitchfork cleaner. Satan was trying not to giggle. He shoved his fist against his mouth as he looked at Tom. Pitchfork cleaner? Tom replied. Yep, Satan said, stifling his giggling as he spoke. Your job is to clean all the pitchforks of all the lesser imps and demons. Satan was shaking, biting his lip. All of them. A small giggle broke through. All the pitchforks. Tom sighed, then nodded. All right, then. When do I start? You start, Satan let out a burst of laughter. You start? Never, because that's a joke. I got you again. Tom shrugged. Yeah, you got me good that time. You were all pitchforks. I don't know. Satan crossed his eyes and threw up his hands. That's you. That's what you look like. He crossed his eyes and shrugged again. Pitchforks. I don't know. Priceless? Satan slapped his hand on the desk and laughed. Tom just sat and waited for him to finish. You're a good sport, Tom, Satan said. Hey, tell you what. You want to help me prank the next guy? What? Really? Can I? Sure. Let's do it. Satan hit the intercom button on his phone. He looked up at Tom, pointing a finger to his lips to shush him as he tried containing his laughter. Nibus, is that you? Yeah, Satan cut him off. Are you there, Nibus? I can't hear you. Yes, this is... Nibus, can you hear me? It's Satan. I can... Nibus, can you hear me, Nibus? A heavy sigh came over the intercom as Satan chuckled. Can you hear me? Can't you, sir? Gotcha, Satan said, laughing. That never gets old, does it? Another heavy sigh came over the intercom before Nibus spoke. Nope, never. Nibus, can you send up the next one? Satan stood up from behind his desk and ran over to the elevator, motioning for Tom to join him. This is going to be good. So, what about my assignment, Tom asked. Oh, yes, about that, Satan said. I'll be honest with you, Tom. Hell's a pretty boring place for me. You want to just hang out? Help me welcome new humies? Tom shrugged. Sure, why not? Great. Let's get ready for the new guy. Where's your pitchfork? Satan asked. Tom shook his head. I didn't get a pitchfork. Did you already lose your pitchfork? That's pretty serious, Tom. You need your pitchfork. But I didn't get one downstairs. Tom began. Then noticed that Satan's eyes were bulging as he bit his lower lip to contain his laughter. Is this another joke? Satan laughed, smacking Tom in the back. You catch on quick.
Chilling tales for dark nights.